Hello and welcome to this compilation of all of the videos about building a royal court. In this compilation you will find the types of courtiers organized by their level of wickedness and competence. You will find the icebergs of royal courts. You will find the ways that a king can control access and can control his court. You will find the conflict that kings use to ensure no one can move against them. You will find the mistakes people make with royal courts. And you will also find the way to build a royal guard that acts as a plot-relevant structure. All the codes in this compilation should work should you wish to buy anything from my store. Some of them might already have been used up, but most of them should work. And other than that, I hope that you enjoy this compilation, and I will see you on the far side.
When you think of an aristocrat in a fantasy story, do you imagine a Peter Baelish or a Robert Baratheon? Or maybe you think of Mercedes Lackey's Queen Selene of Valdemar? Perhaps you go darker and consider Abercrombie's Sandan Glokta, Denethor eating tomatoes while his son leads a doomed charge, or the Emperor rotting on his golden throne in Warhammer 40k. And the thing is, all of those are valid types of aristocrats, but they do exist on a spectrum, one might say. And today, in this first video of the series on fantasy courts and how to construct them, we're going to break down the 7 levels of aristocrats. Now, a few ground rules before we jump in. A duke isn't automatically higher than a baron on this list. We aren't just ranking these guys by their legal titles. Instead, we're looking at the political weight, the structural legitimacy, and the survival skill of these nobles. And we'll be pulling examples from everything from Lord of the Rings to Warhammer 40k, which, yes, I do consider part of the fantasy genre. And we'll also be looking at history, and we will see exactly who is doing what and how well they're doing it. Oh, and if you're watching this on your phone right now, go ahead and hit that hype button, or whatever the new feature is YouTube is testing out this week to appease the algorithm lords. Like, comment, subscribes, and welcome to another episode of Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. In level 1, we have the parasitic despots. You know them, you love to hate them. These are people like King Joffrey Baratheon of Game of Thrones, Commodus of the Roman Empire, or King John Lackland of England. These guys are dependent 100% on inheritance. They are destructive in nature and abusive in their personal relationships. They sit on their thrones like giant ticks and suck their kingdoms dry for their own prestige, pleasure, or ego. They're basically a wrecking ball, and when these types come to power and stay in power, you're generally assured that the kingdom, the empire, or whatever it is starting to wind downward as its legitimacy and strength fades. Now, all of these guys are terrible in a real-world situation. Commodus was a disaster for the Roman Empire, and John Lackland, well, in the long term, signing the Magna Carta was pretty good for Britain, but for England at that time, he was a disaster of a king. And that is because their focus is completely on themselves. They pay no attention to the broader strategic aims of their kingdom, and they basically treat the state as their personal property. But while that makes them disastrous in the real world, it makes them fantastic for telling a story or running a campaign in a fantasy world. Think of how many plot points erupt out of Joffrey's behavior. Joffrey's behavior ends Ned's life and creates the whole arc of Robb Stark and his drive toward King's Landing. Joffrey's behavior creates Sansa's arc and makes out of her someone who has rigid control over her emotions. It grows her up as a person and makes her capable of fulfilling a role as a strong political player. Joffrey's behavior causes Arya to run away, encounter the Faceless Man, and undergo her assassin's training, setting off her whole arc. Joffrey's behavior is central to Tywin and Tyrion's relationship, and that arc that spins off out of that. Joffrey's behavior is critical to every plot except, perhaps, Danara's. She is just about the only character who is not directly affected by Joffrey's behavior, and whose plot does not kick off, intersect with, or get derailed by Joffrey's crazy. So, these guys are terrible rulers. You would never wish any of them on a country. But from a story perspective, they are gold. They might be level 1 politically, but they are storytelling masters. And when you are writing them, the key to remember is that they think only of themselves. They think of their own pleasure, their own bank account, their own desires. Everything else is secondary. They do not think of the wealth of their state, the prestige of their nation, or the welfare of their people. Even their family is irrelevant to them. Their goal in life is to maximize themselves. And honestly, other people don't really exist for them. If you write these nobles like that, they can be great generators of plot points, especially because their legitimacy rests on the legitimacy of your whole political system. It wasn't possible to just remove Commodus. He was the Roman emperor. If you remove him, you undermine the legitimacy of the state. In the same way, it wasn't possible to just remove Joffrey. If you depose him or kill him, and it's found out, you undermine the legitimacy of the kingdom. And this was especially relevant in the Seven Kingdoms because they had just been through a rebellion. If they now did a coup or another rebellion or something like that, you create fundamental instability and start opening the potential to a revolving door of kings, which helps no one and certainly not the family of the despot. And in fact, that's what happened after Commodus had that unfortunate incident. His reign was followed by the aptly named Year of 5 Emperors, which was exactly as chaotic as you could imagine. So, if you want to use one of these parasitic despots to maximum effect, set up a situation where it's hard to just remove them, where there are political safeguards preventing them from being easily ousted. Then it becomes a juggling act for everyone else. Do we keep this guy on the throne and try to contain him, which is a game that Tywin tried to play with Joffrey? Or do we actually figure out a way to remove him and manage the consequences, which is the game Lady Olenna of Highgarden played? By the way, I did a video about creating characters like Olenna, which you can check out in the information card. And that's our level 1 parasitic despots and abusers. Let's move on to level 2. In level 2, we have the pillars of the state. These guys are the staple of what I call good guy fantasy. This is where you have people who possess deep systemic legitimacy, and they are, generally speaking, excellent at maximizing their kingdom's strength or their people's happiness and welfare. Their biggest skill is that they are fantastic at governing within the rules. Given the laws and setup of their world, they are good people who strive to maximize the well-being of the people around them. Great examples from fantasy include Queen Selene from Valdemar, who is a herald and is genuinely trying to make everyone in Valdemar as happy and safe as possible. From Game of Thrones, Ned Stark is a perfect example of this. He is completely legitimate within his bloodline and his ruling system, and he is trying to do what is best for his people as he sees it. And from Cashil's Dart, Queen Ysandra is a great example of a pillar of the state. People like this exist in the real world too. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman philosopher emperor, was, as far as we can tell, a good man who genuinely tried to rule according to Stoic principles. Within the context of the political system of his time, he tried to maximize the welfare of his people as he saw it. And bear in mind, these guys aren't looking out for everybody in the entire world. They are looking out for the welfare of their people through their own cultural lens. But this strength is also their flaw. When they are faced with a situation that the rulebook doesn't have an answer for, or where the answer within the rules is a bad one that won't achieve happiness for their people, rulers like this struggle. To return to Valdemar, in the series Arrows of the Queen, Queen Selene's daughter, Elspeth, has fallen under a sway of a nanny. We'll talk more about the power of royal nannies later in this series. This nanny has basically been spoiling the kid, Elspeth, and actively breeding a fear of companions into the heir. Because of this, Selene has no good answers for what happens after her reign. How does the legitimacy of the kingdom continue if her heir is showing signs of being completely incapable of achieving the legitimacy? This presents a massive conundrum for Selene. Does she cut her own child out of the inheritance line and appoint someone else? What does she do, especially since she doesn't initially realize that the nurse is the root of the cause? That dilemma forms the core of Talia's journey as the Queen's own herald in the first book. Talia needs to figure out that it's the nurse, Hilda, who is poisoning Elspeth's mind, and Talia has to counter that influence to get Elspeth to the point where she can be chosen by a companion and thus achieve her legitimacy as heir. So, just because these guys are straight shooters doesn't mean they have to be plot boring. You can absolutely use them in a story by manipulating that exact weakness, their desire to follow the rules of their country. That very dedication to good governance can be used as a flaw they have to overcome, forcing them to either work creatively within the rules, work to change the rules, or find some other way to adapt to the situation and drive the story forward. Now, while these pillars of state are great at running the country while the gears are greased, what happens if you have zero birthright, zero land, and the old money wants you dead? Let's talk about level 3, the tap dancers. In level 3, we have the people who have zero systemic legitimacy, but they take fake it till you make it to the absolute next level. Littlefinger from Game of Thrones is one of the best examples of this. Littlefinger is amazing. He was born to a minor, dirt-poor house on a rocky coastline called the Fingers. His family crest is literally a stonehead. He claws his way up to become Lord Protector of the Vale through an absolutely wonderful streak of embezzlement, blackmail, political assassination, and marrying exactly who he has to marry. He becomes the master of coin down in King's Landing and orchestrates Ned Stark's betrayal. His whole setup is just insane tap dancing. He has almost nothing except his own wits, and he basically constructs a massive house of cards, knowing that it's either going to fall down on top of him, or he's going to use it to climb all the way to the top. Sandan Glokta from Joe Abercrombie's First Law is another great example here. He came back from the war as a broken, tortured prisoner, and he basically clawed his way to the top of the Inquisition through sheer bloody utility, applying his skills, manipulating people, and achieving great rank because he made himself indispensable. We have brilliant historical examples of these tap dancers too. Take Thomas Cromwell. He was a blacksmith's son from Putney who rose to become Henry VIII's chief minister, structurally dismantling the Catholic Church in England through legal tap dancing, before eventually losing his head. As I said, these guys play for keeps. They're either going to win big or they're going to end up dead in a ditch. There's no in between. Another great example of this is Piers Gaveston, who was just a Gascon knight's son. Because Edward II, and let's be honest now, the man was as gay as the day was long, and because he fell head over heels in love with Gaveston, Piers was able to manipulate Edward and stay on friendly enough terms with Queen Isabella to basically rule the kingdom. Of course, the other nobles of England didn't take too kindly to that, and Gaveston eventually had a fatal appointment with the executioner's block, courtesy of those angry barons. He was followed by Hugh Despenser, who is another perfect example of this setup. If you don't have the birthright for what you're doing, but you manage to manipulate, bribe, and politic your way into a position of absolute rule far beyond any legal legitimacy. The risk these guys always run is that because of that complete lack of legitimacy, no one is going to cry if you end up dead in a ditch. Unlike the parasitic despot who is protected by the systemic inertia of their crown, and unlike the good guy rulers who have deep legitimacy and the love of the people, the tap dancers have to protect themselves every single second. If the dance fails, they have no fallback. You slip up, you're dead, and the court just moves on. To survive, your network either needs to be so widespread that no one can safely take you out without destroying themselves, or you need to have sufficient personal military strength, or magical strength in the case of a fantasy world, to keep yourself continuously safe. And normally what happens is that they underestimate someone just once and end up in that ditch. Just before we leave our bottom feeders behind and move on to discuss the master manipulators, I have some exciting news. I've just launched the Kickstarter pre-launch page for my upcoming fantasy novel, Blood and Bloom in Las Vegas. Blood and Bloom is an urban fantasy mystery written in a gritty noir style, featuring a druid protagonist. It actually won the Flash 500 novel opening competition, and it has all of the deep, intricate world-building elements you'd expect from the creator of this channel. That includes a fully realized magical economy where fairy dust is the base component. No fairy dust, no spells for you. And that means navigating the complex politics of keeping the local Bloomfae happy. The story also has deep mythological roots stretching all the way back to ancient Babylonian myths, and it actively draws on those myths and brings them into the modern world. If that sounds like the kind of story you'd like to read, follow the link down below and hit on the Notify Me button so that you get an email the second the Kickstarter goes live in July. Okay, back to the show. Next, we come to the powerhouses of machinations and political fantasy, the master manipulators. Now, these guys are different from your tap dancers in one crucial way. They have legitimacy. They aren't just building a fragile house of cards to claw their way to the top. They aren't wholly dependent on somebody else the way Gaveston was on Edward II, or the way Littlefinger was on the Baratheon kings and the Lady of the Eyrie. They have their own structural power base, but they are also cunning, manipulative, and incredibly strong in their own right. We have an amazing historical example in the shape of Cardinal Richelieu of the Three Musketeers fame. Now, Cardinal Richelieu gets a very bad reputation in Alexandre Dumas' stories. But in point of fact, the Cardinal was actually quite good for France. He successfully checked the power of the global Habsburg dynasty, and he worked tirelessly to ensure French dominion in the 30 Years' War, even to the point of allying with Protestant nations, despite having ruthlessly suppressed the domestic Huguenot rebellions of the 1620s. He was also an alumnus of the University of Paris and the headmaster of the College of Sorbonne, renovating and extending the institutions, and he became famous for his patronage of the arts, founding the Académie Française, the learned society responsible for maintaining the French language to this day. So, he genuinely wasn't as horrifying as Dumas made him out to be. Instead, he was a master manipulator, using his inherent legitimacy as a cardinal, combined with his direct access to the French king, to forge a centralized state that worked for his vision of France. And that's important when creating a master manipulator, because unlike the parasitic despot, these guys aren't solely focused on themselves. They are focused on the state. Yes, they personally benefit, but the state benefits a great deal from their competence as well. Another incredible historical example comes from Sweden. Count Axel Oxenstierna. He became the High Counselor to King Gustavus Adolphus when the king took the throne at the age of just 17. Axel was about 10 years older than Gustav, and the two became close friends, launching sweeping military and administrative reforms that turned Sweden into a global superpower. After Gustavus Adolphus fell in the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, Axel took the lead in the war. He became the practical ruler of Sweden, stabilizing a weak wartime economy while maintaining a complex balancing act alliance with both the German Protestants and Catholic France. Axel was one of those brilliant minds behind the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which rewrote modern international diplomacy and solidified Sweden as a great power. And if you want a powerhouse example of a woman in this role, look no further than Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, pop culture loves to paint medieval queens as passive victims or helpless bystanders, but Eleanor was a titan of structural power. She didn't have to tap dance for her position. She inherited the massive, wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, making her the most eligible and powerful duchess in Europe. She became the Queen of France by marrying Louis, and when that marriage fell apart, she pivoted and married Henry, becoming the Queen of England. Eleanor was a master manipulator because she understood exactly how to wield that wealth and her geographic territory and her family ties like a grandmaster playing chess. When her relationship with Henry soured and he locked her away in prison for nearly 16 years, you might think her story was over. But the moment Henry died, Eleanor stepped right back into the light at the age of 67 and effectively took the reins of the Angevin Empire. While her favourite son, Richard the Lionheart, was off fighting the Third Crusade and subsequently getting himself captured and held for ransom in Germany, Eleanor ran the kingdom, managing the domestic administration, suppressing her younger son John's attempts to usurp the throne, and negotiating directly with European emperors and personally organizing the collection of ransom money to get Richard out of that jail. In her late 70s, she literally crossed the Pyrenees Mountains to arrange political marriages that would secure the future of her dynasty. But for all the legitimacy these nobles possess, they do have a systemic vulnerability. They are almost always dependent on their relationship with the monarch for the height of their power. When the relationship between the young Queen Christina of Sweden and the aging Axel weakened, she began political operations against them, and he was eventually forced to retire from the court. Notice again, though, the effect of legitimacy. He did not end up dead in a ditch. When Eleanor and Henry II fell out, he imprisoned her and she lost a great deal of influence. And that is the great weakness to exploit for drama and plot if you're using one of these nobles. Speaking of story, fantasy examples in this level of course include Tywin Lannister and Lady Olenna from Game of Thrones, but also Lord Vetinari from Terry Pratchett's Discworld. Vetinari is a master manipulator who operates on Ankh-Morpork's unique form of democracy. It's a one-man, one-vote system. Vetinari is the man and he has the vote. But honestly, he also plays Ankh-Morpork like a fiddle, manipulating thieves, nobles, and commoners alike. Another great manipulator is Melisande from Cashield's Dart by Jacqueline Carey, who I also did a video about. So, these are figures who possess deep institutional legitimacy, but they are also absolute manipulators of the law, where the weakness of the good guy level 2 rulers is that they often can't find a solution outside the strict rulebook. The master manipulators will stretch the law to its absolute breaking point and step into the shadows outside the law if they have to. They operate in that dark grey area of Machiavellian tactics. From a story perspective, the drama comes from their relationship with power. Because most master manipulators are attached to a crown rather than wearing it, Lord Vetinari and Louis XIV, the Sun King, being rare exceptions who consolidated both roles, their biggest weakness is that they are entirely dependent on keeping the royal relationship intact. Whether it's a relationship based on blood and intimidation like Tywin and Joffrey, or a relationship built on hard-won respect like Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII, it is a connection they have to put immense effort into maintaining. And as a writer, targeting that specific relationship is your key to telling great political stories. Okay, so far we've covered interesting but normal-ish types of nobles. Now, let's turn to the fantastical and speak about immortals. Look, writing immortals is hard, which is why I have done not one, not two, but 3 videos all about immortals, which you can check out in the links. But immortals make for some really interesting politics, as we can see with everything from Tolkien's elves to the vampire counts of Sylvania in Warhammer Fantasy, or the undead nobility of Karnath in the Eberron campaign setting. So, let's talk a little bit about why this specific form of politics is so fascinating. What immortals bring to the table is a temporal advantage that is just plain hard for mortals to counter. They have time. They can literally just sit on their backsides and wait for the pesky humans to die of old age. The downside of these guys, depending on whose perspective you're looking from, is that because of their immensely long lives, they tend to be completely distanced from their subjects. This is even more acute in the case of the undead, like the von Karsteins of Sylvania or the immortal vampire lords of Karnath, because the undead view their subjects as literal livestock. They look at the peasantry and think, food. That, understandably, creates a very alienating effect at court. The positive side of having these long-lived nobles is that they have the unique ability to plan far into the future, way beyond the span of a single human life, and they have the temporal stability to actually guide that plan across centuries. Surprisingly, very few fantasy writers take advantage of this. Even Tolkien's elves don't really guide the world very well. They mostly just push back against Sauron's vision, which, don't get me wrong, that's good, and they try to preserve the past. However, we do have one brilliant implementation of a long-lived entity guiding a society, which actually comes from science fiction, specifically from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. In the later books, it's revealed that the second foundation has been quietly, generationally, guiding the first foundation toward a specific macro-historical vision of the future. To my mind, that is one of the absolute best implementation of an immortal equivalent in politics. If you are going to include immortal elves or vampires as politicians in your world, this is what I want to see. I want them to have sweeping, long-range vision, because that actually capitalizes on the primary strength of being immortal. Neglecting that is, in my opinion, one of the biggest mistakes fantasy world builders make. The weakness of these hegemons, as I mentioned, is their emotional and cultural distance from their short-lived people. And from a storyteller's perspective, if you make their immortality and power absolute, it becomes very hard for them to interact with regular politics. They stop being characters and start acting as a MacGuffin plot device. Take Sauron, for example. Sauron does have a grand vision and he's driving towards a specific point. He wants to turn Middle-earth into his personally, highly ordered playground. The immortal elves oppose him, but their viewpoint is fundamentally conservative. They don't have an equal positive vision for the future. They just want to maintain the status quo. Furthermore, Sauron is so powerful in his immortality that it is almost impossible to oppose him through standard political or military means without literal divine intervention. In the end, you need an epic quest where two hobbits drag a ring across a continent to dump it into a volcano. You have to destroy the MacGuffin item just to make the immortal king vulnerable. Now, that is fine, but bear in mind that the literal father of modern fantasy followed that exact plot. If you are going to write a story like that, you need to make sure that your implementation, your details, and your magic system feel fresh, so that you aren't just doing a straight-up retelling of Lord of the Rings. So, use that core dynamic of immortal politics, the clashing of long-term visions, the frozen opposition between ancient powers, and the profound distancing effect between rulers and population. It's a great political weakness for characters, but it's an incredible narrative strength for you, the world builder. Now, that was a very fantastical look, and historically speaking, there aren't really human equivalents to true immortals. We could talk about Bronze Age rulers advertising themselves as god kings, but at the end of the day, they weren't immortal. There is, however, a perfect historical equivalent for our next level. Let's move on to level 6, dynastic founders. These guys make a massive sweeping impact on their region, their bloodline, and their kingdom. They are the founders of a new dynasty. They successfully take whatever legitimacy they had or did not have and create a brand new legitimacy out of it that they can pass on to their heirs. They are, generally speaking, rather different from our level 3 tap dancers. Tap dancers very rarely get to found dynasties. It does happen, but it's rare. It is much more likely that your dynastic founders are figures wielding massive military might, wielding terrifying magic, or otherwise bludgeoning and beating their various rivals into absolute submission in order to found their house. A great real-world example of this is William the Conqueror, who laid the groundwork for what would become the Plantagenet dynasty after conquering England in 1066 by defeating Harold Godwinson. That whole arrow through the eye situation. He created the whole institutional framework that spawned basically every English monarch until Queen Elizabeth I died without children, with, of course, a few breaks and civil wars in between. In a fantasy context, the perfect mirror to this is Aegon the Conqueror, who I am convinced George R.R. Martin based on William the Conqueror. Aegon Targaryen brought his dragons across the narrow sea, blew up the existing status quo of the separate kingdoms, and founded a brand new unified realm and dynasty after the fall of Valyria. Another good historical example operating in a slightly less brutal conquest vein is Charlemagne. He founded what would become the Holy Roman Empire, taking over from the old Merovingian kings. Now, technically, his grandfather, Charles the Hammer Martel, started the takeover, and Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, did a lot of the heavy lifting. But Charlemagne is the true dynastic founder who consolidated that power. He was absolutely viewed as the ultimate ancestral patriarch and had an entire mythos grew up around him, like the Song of Roland, which talks about his 12 paladins, and all of those other legendary tales. This is the archetype that gives you that profound father of our house, father of our nation vibe. From a storyteller's perspective, dynastic founders are fantastic because of their pure driving ambition. Either opposing them or working on their behalf can provide great character motivations. You can have a character who completely falls in love with the dynastic founder's grand vision, attaching themselves to that cause and driving forward with them into the future. Or you can have a character who is fundamentally opposed to them, fighting to protect the old ways from being crushed under the wheels of a new empire. One of the most interesting implementations I've seen of a dynastic foundation and renewal is in Catherine Kerr's Devery series. To understand it, you first have to know that the Devery books are a sprawling epic based on reincarnation, allowing you to explore the kingdom's history from its very first tribal founding all the way to its high Middle Ages. Somewhere in the middle of that history, the original royal dynasty falls apart because they run out of heirs. The realm collapses into 3 bitter warring factions, resulting in decades of brutal civil war and anarchy. To fix this, a master sorcerer named Navain decides he is going to manufacture a one true king to park his backside on the throne and end the civil war, once and for all. Navain finds a likely lad called Merrin with the right ancestral bloodlines, coaches the boy, and uses magic and political stagecraft to make the boy look incredibly impressive, making it appear as though Moraine is fundamentally destined by the gods to be king. Navain guides the young king all the way through claiming his initial territory to the battlefield to overwhelm the other factions, gaining complete dominance and founding a unified new dynasty. It is a fascinating dynamic to read, blending an immortal mentor like Navain with a dynastic founder who is actively being engineered into a living legend. There are so many incredible things you can play with in this noble archetype, Destiny, war, propaganda, and the brutal logistics of how you actually found a new dynasty, make it stick, and pass it along to your children. And let me tell you, dynastic founders always have skeletons in their closet. No one rises that high without breaking a whole lot of eggs. You know what I'm saying? So even if you use the dynastic founder later in life, there is plenty of drama you can dig up about them. Now, you could easily say that these founders are our top-tier political players. After all, what could possibly be higher than founding a dynasty? Well, there is one final level left. And that, my friends, belongs to the weavers of mythology, the very rare individuals who leave their world fundamentally changed because of how they rise to power. Let's talk about myth weavers. These are exceptionally rare people, and they should be, because they have a truly fundamental paradigm-shifting effect on the world around them. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I am absolutely not a subscriber to the great man of history theory. The same applies here. If it hadn't been one of these specific individuals who made these massive sweeping changes, the socio-economic pressures of the era probably would have pushed somebody else into the gap to do it. But these figures still possess an elite, magnificently effective skill set, and they leave an enormous, undeniable impact on the world, and that does deserve acknowledgement. So, I'm not denying their impact, I'm just saying they are the product of their time, their environment, and the structural forces behind them. So who are we talking about when we talk about these myth weavers? Let's start in the real world, because yes, we do have historical people who wielded this kind of influence. The one I want to highlight first is Augustus Caesar, born Octavian, the first emperor of Rome and the adopted heir of Julius Caesar. Octavian was a political genius. He wasn't just smart and ruthlessly aware of how power worked. He also deeply understood his own weaknesses. He was not a battlefield commander. He was not a military strategist. And overcoming that deficit as a Roman leader is a pretty staggering feat, because their entire political legitimacy was built on martial prowess and military might. But Octavian overcame his limitation by securing the absolute loyalty and friendship of Marcus Agrippa. And Agrippa was a strategic genius and a phenomenal battlefield commander. Octavian's single greatest political coup was gaining Agrippa's friendship, keeping it, and completely trusting him. Trusting his general ensured that Octavian didn't need to take the field. He could let Agrippa run the military, while he focused entirely on the politics and the propaganda. And it worked. Octavian's second great skill was his ability to see which way the wind was blowing and guide the gale himself, making whatever ruthless, pragmatic deals he had to make. He despised Mark Antony, but he still formed a triumvirate with him and Lepidus to split up the Roman world, using that alliance until he was strong enough to destroy them. When he achieved absolute power, he acted ruthlessly to consolidate the empire while keeping the common people on his side. He managed the narrative, found his military anchor in Agrippa, and fundamentally reshaped the Western world in a way that still echoes in our legal and political systems today. On the fantasy side, we can look at a few absolute titans. I promised you we'd talk about Warhammer 40k, so let's look at the God Emperor of mankind. Now, by the time most of us are playing in the current setting, he's a rotting corpse sitting on the golden throne, acting as a psychic lighthouse for humanity's warp travel. But leading up to that point, he had completely engineered the history of the human species. He rose to power, united a shattered Earth, drove humanity into the stars, launched the Great Crusades against alien threats, and fought a cosmic war against the ruinous powers of chaos. He is 100% locked into Mythweaver status. In epic fantasy, Rand al'Thor, the dragon reborn from Wheel of Time, certainly changed his world, and shows how these kind of characters can be used to create great stories if you follow him for 13 books? Or is it 15? Some huge amount of story. These characters and historical figures leave their world transformed by their presence, their politics, and their actions. When you're writing a level 7 political myth weaver, you aren't just writing a politician. You're writing a tectonic shift, someone who shatters the board and rewrites the rules for the next 1,000 years. And now, while the epic members of the channel scroll past, the incredible humans who changed my world by making these videos possible, let me talk about a few honorable mentions and how these levels can fluidly flow together. My biggest caveat to you in this whole video is this: don't get stuck thinking that a character must exist only in one single level forever. Rulers and courtiers are dynamic. For example, I really love the Kashyl Legacy books by Jacqueline Carey, the whole Kashyl's Dart series from beginning to end. In there, you have Vedre no Delaunay, who is a courtesan and a brilliant courtier. She exists somewhere in the grey area between these levels. She starts out with zero systemic legitimacy, essentially tap dancing to survive, before she is elevated to nobility. From there, she operates as a master manipulator, but she simultaneously possesses the exact heart and attitude of a pillar of the state, because she is constantly putting her life on the line to do what is right for the realm. She is essentially a master manipulator with a heart of gold. You could say she's a tap dancer who grows into a master manipulator but maintains the soul of a pillar of state. In Game of Thrones, you could make an argument that Peter Baelish is a master manipulator, though I personally prefer categorizing him as a pure tap dancer. Sansa Stark starts the story as a passive victim of a level 1 parasite, but she ends the story as a highly skilled manipulator in her own right. And my key takeaway for you is this: characters change, and indeed, to engage the reader, characters must change. In addition, it's important to remember that the context and perspective also matter immensely. In the real world and in fiction, a ruler might be celebrated as a just pillar of state by their own people because they are maximizing their realm's welfare. But to the neighboring kingdom they just invaded, they are viewed as a brutal, conquering destroyer. And I also want to emphasize that these levels aren't just for noble courts. You can adapt them to all sorts of forms of government. For example, I thoroughly enjoyed the Powder Mage trilogy by Brian McClellan, which offers a brilliant exploration of these dynamics outside of the aristocracy. You enter that story immediately after a French Revolution-style event. The politicians you meet are people who have actively engaged in overthrowing the monarchy. Field Marshal Tomas is a fascinating figure here, because he has the exact energy, drive, and impact of a level 6 dynastic founder, perhaps even a myth weaver, except he isn't actually founding a bloodline dynasty. He is founding a new republic born from a revolution. He is a systemic founder, establishing a new framework of government, which makes him incredible to analyze. Surrounding Tomas, you have an entire ecosystem of other levels. You have Richard, the Union boss, who operates like a tap dancer, shading into a master manipulator. You have various other figures acting as puppet masters behind the scenes. I won't spoil the major plot twist, but that series is a great exploration of politics during a transitional era, watching a fantasy world pivot away from traditional nobility and toward early democracy. I highly recommend that trilogy to anyone who hasn't picked it up yet. And on that note, if you made it this far into the video, leave me a crown emoji down in the comments. If you want to see more from me on the messy mechanics of nobility, go ahead and check out my video on how to inherit a crown, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World Building. The thing about fantasy courts filled with glittering nobles and all their various politics, nasty or nice, is that they come in so many flavors. And those flavors range from the completely unrealistic good guys all the way to the all the way down to the most horrifying, cynical exercise in showing that nothing matters except the elites exploiting our lives. Because that's the case, I thought that today, in the second episode of our series on world-building fantasy courts, we could discuss the iceberg of fantasy courts and their implementation. We'll start at the very top with the ones that are a little bit too good to be true, the ones that make us feel genuinely good about the ruling elite, and steadily descend down into the depths of the more corrupt, the more vicious, and the downright evil. If you're watching this on your phone right now, go ahead and tap that hype button or whatever feature YouTube is testing out this week to appease the algorithm gods. Like, comment, and subscribe, and welcome to another episode of Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. Alright, let's start at the hopeful top, the part of the iceberg above the water, the shining spires, where everything looks wonderful and the darker depths are hidden from us. In this category, we're looking at the courts that are overwhelmingly ruled by people with the best of intentions. Now, that is not to say that things don't go wrong. There are absolutely things that go wrong in these courts, and there are sometimes evil, scheming people operating in the shadows. But the rulers in charge and the people who generally win the stories are almost inevitably the good guys, the ones with the best intentions for everybody in the kingdom. In this category, we have the court of Tortal from the Tamora Pierce universe. The royal family there is, generally speaking, exceptionally well-intentioned. Even if they do sometimes have to engage in a bit of realpolitik, they still actively try to accommodate the best interests of their subjects, and even their spy masters are fundamentally decent people. Also in this category is the court of Valdemar from Mercedes Lackey's books. This is the absolute blueprint for this kind of high-trust court. The monarch, by the very laws of Valdemar, literally cannot be anything other than ideal, because they are chosen by a companion. A companion simply would not choose someone who is wicked, and they would actively reject a ruler who turned wicked. So even if the monarch is temporarily misguided or being led down the garden path by bad advice, they are still very definitively on the side of angels, trying to do the absolute best they can. So, that is our sunny top, the really pretty part of the iceberg. Now, let's slide down a little lower and hit the waterline. Alright, now we move down and we're talking about a more realistic court environment, but one that is still generally structured so that the good guys are more prevalent than the bad guys, even if the villains do sometimes come out on top temporarily. A great example of this is in Tolkien's main stories. I'm not talking about his earlier lore like the Silmarillion, I'm talking about the actual narrative of the Lord of the Rings. In these courts, the good guys generally win out, and the institutions themselves are fundamentally good. I mean, even Denethor was actually a capable leader who just fell off the wagon toward the very end under the weight of despair, and he was ultimately replaced by Aragorn, who was, of course, a very good king. Over in Rohan, we see King Theoden fall under a terrible corrupting influence, but the moment he is cleansed of it, he immediately starts making good decisions again. So it's very much a world where the good guys come out on top, even though bad things do happen, and bad actors will occasionally seize the reins of power. Another brilliant example of this, much as I love her, it's true that she's not super cynical, is Jacqueline Carey, the author of the Cashel books. The court of Terre d'Ange is absolutely gorgeous. Now, there are flaws in this court, don't get me wrong. They're completely beauty obsessed, and they are extremely class orientated, and there are definitely dark underbellies to high society. In that sense, it feels much more realistic than, say, Valdemar or Tortal. But it is also a world where the spy masters ultimately have the best interest of the realm at heart, and the worst villains generally don't win. For the most part, the good guys come out on top, even when they have to make incredibly hard decisions and difficult choices, and the leaders genuinely try to make the best possible moves for the sake of the kingdom. I think that is the baseline for our waterline. Generally, good people are in charge, but there have been times when bad people achieve dominance through underhanded means, resulting in some crazy political shenanigans. For example, later in Carrie's Imreal trilogy, there is a period of time when the entire court of Ter de Ange falls under the control of a truly malicious magical spell. It brings out the absolute worst in everyone, and it gives us a very interesting look at Queen Ysandra, who is at that point being a terrible ruler rather than a good one. The thing about these smooth sailing courts is that they are fantastic. There is absolutely nothing wrong with having a non-cynical approach to politics or establishing a generally well-intentioned court. You're not going to be writing grim dark like that, of course, but if your aim is to write political fantasy where you have incredibly cunning adversaries, these courts are perfect. At the end of the day, your readers can fully get behind the protagonists and cheer for them as they eventually outmaneuver the antagonists, see through their complex schemes, or unpick the knots that have been tied around the court. These kinds of courts give the reader a powerful reason to invest in the politics and cheer for the characters. But this wouldn't be an iceberg video if we didn't plunge beneath the surface and talk about the maelstrom of darkness that awaits us further down. Just before we get there, give me one moment to tell you about World Building Blueprints. This is the comprehensive book I wrote on the craft of world building, which you can pick up on my website right now. Politics occupies a chunky section of the book, covering everything from governance structures and economics to social hierarchy and political symbology. And the book isn't just dry theory, it is packed with actionable exercises, real examples, and some truly gorgeous custom art, which looks great even in the black and white paperback edition. Because you're watching the series, I'm throwing in a special discount. If you use the code Iceberg, all caps, the first 100 people will get a massive 20% off the paperback edition. Links to all of that are in the description down below. Now, back to your scheduled programming. Okay, so this is the part of the iceberg where we start getting quite far onto the dark side. This is where you have leaders in charge who might not have the best will of the people under them in mind, and certainly leaders who are not great on a personal level. This is quite a broad category, and Catherine Kerr falls right here for me. The Devery courts are actually quite brutal. They are deeply hierarchical, rigidly structured, and the nobles, generally speaking, are not super pleasant people. There is a magnificent storyline during the Westland cycle where they are working to put the true king, King Moraine, onto the throne. It's a stunning part of the series, but the more you uncover about Moraine as a person, the more you realize that while he might have some baseline ethics, and he tries to apply himself to the kingdom on a macro level, as an individual human being, he needs a short, sharp slap across the chops. He treats his wife incredibly poorly by constantly cheating on her. Now, sure, that's what high status men did at that time, but it's a lot less fun for the woman, and because she is a POV character, you are forced to feel the raw pain of that betrayal. Secondly, he starts an affair with a girl at the castle who happens to be in love with one of his loyal, high-ranking soldiers. To get the soldier out of the way, Moraine basically orders him back to the front lines of the war, just so that he can have a shot with the girl. It was such a cynical, self-serving move to put one of his most loyal men in a position where he might literally die, just so the king could get his rocks off. A little lower down in the exact same category, we have George R.R. Martin. Now, Martin does have some genuinely good people in his courts. As I spoke about in my previous video, Ned Stark was a profoundly good man for his era and his world. But look at the people surrounding him. Robert Baratheon might have started out his reign with relatively good intentions, but just like King Moraine in the Devery books, Robert became a worse person and a worse king the longer he sat on the throne, until he was basically an alcoholic with almost no moral lines, and his legal son, Joffrey, was an outright monster. These are courts defined by corrupt people in charge, deep systemic rot, and entrenched exploitation. They might steer toward a macro level goal that looks vaguely stable or goodish, but on an individual personal level, these are not the people you want in charge of your life. From a storyteller's perspective, these kinds of courts are magnificent for exploring human frailty and the corrupting nature of power. Power does inherently corrupt people by systemically stripping away their empathy. It distances them from the rest of humanity, making the elites believe that they achieve their wealth or power solely by their own merit. They adopt the mindset of, well, if I could do it, anyone could do it, and completely disregard structural advantages, luck, or inherited wealth. That is exactly what Catherine Kerr achieved with Moraine. She showed the corrupting influence of power on a character whom the reader watched grow up as a good kid, only to see him transform into a ruthless womanizer you wouldn't want anywhere near your daughters. With the Song of Ice and Fire, I think the story Martin is telling is that even if individuals are inherently good, it doesn't matter if the institutions themselves are fundamentally bad. If the system is so strictly hierarchical and toxic that there is no social mobility and that survival requires brutality, the good will always fail. That is my personal theory about Ned Stark's death. Ned died to prove to the audience that a good man cannot survive within a corrupt institution because the corruption will inevitably weaponize his honor against them. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that bleak outlook as an absolute rule of life. I believe that institutional corruption can be beaten, and you can check out my video on corruption in world building to see exactly how you can play with that idea as a creator. But that dark institutional trap was precisely the story Martin wanted to tell, and his Midwater Court is the perfect stage for it. Next, we plunge into the deep water at the bottom of the iceberg. So, this is the darkest part of the iceberg. There is no honor, there is no glory, there is no divine right. There is only institutional rot, old men pulling the strings, and complete moral bankruptcy. For this level, we return to Joe Abercrombie. If we look at the court of the Union in Adao, the king is a drooling puppet. The actual court is run by the closed council, which is essentially an administrative engine of torture, debt collection, and cold hard calculations. It is completely stripped of any royal glamour. The grand savior figure of the realm is actually a ruthless ancient mage named Byers, who views the entire kingdom as nothing more than a bank account and a meat shield. And if we look at Abercrombie's new book, The Devils, we see a religious court that is heavily based on the historical papal court of Europe. And oh boy, are they corrupt. They cynically keep a stable of evil mythological creatures that are deployed as weapons whenever the church needs them. They will make whatever backroom deals they have to make in order to achieve the political aims of the people in charge. And they just don't care about the values they're supposed to uphold. They certainly don't care about their religion, for all that they will mouth the words and make the ritual signs. They are clearly in this game to maintain their own power and prestige and the prestige of their institution, rather than bring any glory to their god. Also in this category, I count the governance of Dune with the Landsraad, the Emperor, the Spicing Guild, and the Bene Gesserit. All of the politics in Dune are explicitly built on the premise of we are here for us, and you peasant, are just the resource that's going to die. It's deeply cynical. Warhammer 40k lives right down here as well with the High Lords of Terror. You have the Emperor rotting on the Golden Throne, and surrounding him are elites who are very cynically using him to enforce a state religion, despite the fact that the Emperor himself explicitly espoused a strictly secular, anti-religion perspective when he was alive. It's a profoundly power-hungry court dedicated entirely to maintaining its own status. These elites will use and abuse any law, break any norm, as long as they can get away with it to enrich themselves. To them, that is the only reason the court exists and the only reason the world exists. From a writing perspective, these kinds of courts are great for telling stories about deep, systemic corruption and for highlighting the raw struggle of everyday people trapped in this kind of environment. If you are not part of the elite, how do you survive in a world like this? I think that was one of the most interesting aspects of the Devils to me. One of our protagonists is just a girl from the streets trying to cope in a world of high-level elites. And it is absolute insanity. The more she uncovers, the more she realizes that these high and mighty nobles are no different from common street thugs. They just have infinitely more power than street thugs. To me, that was the core message of that setting, the sheer thuggery that gets applied at the elite level. Now, I am not so cynical that I believe that this is true for our real world, at least not in all governments all the time. But it is an incredibly fascinating theme to explore as a fiction writer, the absolute depths to which corruption can drag us, and the structural toll it inflicts on a society when the ruling class falls to that extent. So, here we are at the bottom of the iceberg. And is this the bottom of the video? No. Next, the Mariana Trench. These are courts that, frankly, I think really only exist in the realm of epic fantasy itself. Your straight-up, unapologetically evil courts. To explore this, I'm actually going to draw on both of our earlier Waterline authors, Tolkien and Jacqueline Carey, because both of them also wrote some of the darkest, most vile courts imaginable. These are courts that make absolutely no pretense of being anything other than what they are. Systems engineered purely on absolute malice of mortals and dark divinities. In Tolkien's case, this is the court of Sauron himself, with the Nazgul and the mouth of Sauron and all of his terrifying captains. This is an entire institutional hierarchy based solely on those who believe in nothing but power and using that power to inflict themselves upon humanity and reduce everyone else to mere playthings. Similarly, in Jacqueline Carey's third book, Shield's Avatar, the protagonists encounter the horrific court of the Markigar in the mountain fortress of Darsanga. This setting is heavily based on ancient Zoroastrian mythology and its cosmic duality. You have the good god Ahura Mazda and the evil god Angry Manyu. In Carey's world, Angry Manyu is locked behind a mystical doorway, but if that door is ever opened, it will unleash 1,000 years of literal and spiritual darkness upon the earth. The Markigar has deliberately made himself that doorway, cracking it open so that his entire court can be built on the active worship of Angry Manyu and the literal creed of ill thoughts, ill words, ill deeds. And let me tell you, it is a profoundly vile court. They burn dogs for sport. At one point, the Markigar takes 2 captured priests of Ahura Mazda and treats them like ponies. His warriors sit on the backs of these 2 old men and charge at each other to fight. People die every single night in his great hall just battling each other for the Markigar's personal amusement. He will force enslaved women from his seraglio to fight to the death, or casually toss them to his soldiers to be assaulted right there on the banquet tables. It was truly a deprived, nightmarish environment. Now, writing an environment this extreme makes for great storytelling in both authors' cases because it perfectly sets up a titanic clash between good and evil. If that is the foundational story you want to tell, having a court this monstrous gives your heroes the ultimate antagonist to overcome. But it also allows a writer to explore a very interesting, highly realistic psychological effect. The people who choose to make their peace with a nightmare. It allows you to showcase the characters who look at a monstrosity and say, well, it might not be nice, but I need to survive. I need to get my bag. If I don't go along with the Markigar, I won't get my revenge on the people I hate. I won't get the land I want, and I won't survive. It explores the go along to get along mentality, where people simply close their eyes, choose not to look too closely, and accept that the world is just inherently harsh. This was incredibly evident throughout Carrie's Darsanga storyline. So many of the neighboring factions and nations had either completely given up trying to resist this evil court, or they had actively started working with it because, well, the Markigar was the one in power. He offers practical opportunities, and if you can stomach the daily brutality, you can carve out a piece of wealth for yourself. It was a deeply uncomfortable look at human nature under pressure. And to me, that is the very bottom of the Mariana Trench, the darkest, most terrifying abyss of fantasy world building, where courts are built on pure, unadulterated evil, and people work alongside it. And now, while the epic members of the channel scroll past, the incredible humans who make this channel possible and get early, ad-free access to my content, let me tell you about the kind of court I like to build in my own fiction and why. Personally, I love a court that blends right at the waterline with maybe a shade or two below. This is where you encounter a bit of corruption, a touch of institutional rot, and a healthy dose of cynicism and political maneuvering, but there is still hope. I do not love the completely sunlit court at the very top, because to me that feels unrealistic. But I genuinely prefer a slightly more hopeful style of politics than the pitch black darkness you find as you slide down toward the Martin and Abercrombie line in the deeper parts of the iceberg. The reason for this is simple. I feel like looking at fictional politics with absolute cynicism trains us to look at our own real world politics with that same absolute cynicism. And yes, of course, politicians are not always the best people. Believe me, I get that. Pol Pot, Moustache Guy, and so on. Even the current evening news gives us heaps of examples of politicians failing us. But those are often systemic failures rather than proof that humanity is inherently evil. See, my problem with saying that all politics is inherently corrupt is that applying a blanket level of total cynicism can easily lead to despair. And I don't want people to despair of real world politics. I want people to be involved in real world politics. I want us to work together to make the actual world a better place, a place where people can live in safety and freedom. Because of that, I don't particularly like to go full grim dark in my writing unless I have a very specific story to tell on how to counter that darkness or find a way out of it. I don't think I could ever write stories like Joe Abercrombie does, where the narrative essentially ends in tragedy. That is not to say that I dislike Abercrombie. I don't at all. I read his books, I thoroughly enjoy them. But that bleakness isn't something I would ever want to write myself. My own stories tend to steer towards being more hopeful because, despite my own cynicism, I possess a fundamental hope for humanity. And I think that that is a hopeful note to end on. If you have made it this far into the depths of the iceberg with me, leave me a sun emoji in the comments for the sake of optimism. And if you want more deep dive world building analysis from me, you can check out my previous Iceberg video on fantasy governments, which covers everything from absolute kingdoms all the way down to artificial minds. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon for another episode. You know all those scenes in Game of Thrones inside the Red Keep where you have the court arrayed in all their finery and the courtiers are all chatting or playing their games or entertaining each other and hosting little feasts? The thing about those scenes is that to truly understand them requires knowing how a noble court is actually constructed. It requires understanding the architecture of power, the people who make up the court, the legitimacy applied to those people, and the language they use to communicate with each other, and the low-level internal Cold War that dominates every single palace. That is going to be the topic of today's discussion in this third episode on our series of how to create fantasy courts. If you're watching this on your phone and you're excited, go ahead and hit that hype button or whatever new feature YouTube is testing out this week to appease the algorithm lords. Like, comment, subscribe, and welcome to another episode of Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. First, we're going to talk about the foundations of legitimacy. Why and how does a noble get to be in court in the first place? And how does status apply to them? This also applies to our court overall on the macro level. What is the court's dominant source of legitimacy? Different societies have completely different definitions of authorities. So let's go through the various foundations of legitimacy that you can apply to your royal court. The first and most obvious foundation is raw military power. The feudal systems in both medieval Europe and the Far East originally arose by elite warriors bringing order to chaotic, fractured landscapes. We see this in Japan's feudal history, which, while it wasn't exactly the same as European feudalism, features a highly recognizable martial class system. When military might is the foundation of power, a noble's court is built entirely around defense and subjugation. A great example of this is John Gwain's Bloodsworn universe. It's a chaotic environment created by a cataclysmic Ragnarok event, and the Jarls who have risen to take control are all military leaders. They are warriors surrounded by their Drengar, the sworn fighters who serve them. Their systemic legitimacy is derived from the fact that they will actively defend their people from rival warlords and also from the terrifying monsters that are roaming the ruins of the world. Military might gives both individual nobles and the court itself the right to rule. Our second form of legitimacy is bloodline, lineage, and, frequently tied into it, the divine blessings of the gods. In Lord of the Rings, we see Gondor ruled by the ruling stewards for generations. They hold the administrative reins of power because they were originally appointed by the crown. But because they lack the true royal bloodline of Elendil, they are never held in the same mystical regard as the true king. When Aragorn finally shows up, his pure hereditary lineage immediately displaces them. This kind of bloodline legitimacy was incredibly common in our own late medieval history. Rulers and noble houses went to absurd lengths to trace their lineage back to Charlemagne or other legendary conquerors to justify their current status. There is a fascinating exploration of this in Catherine Kerr's Devery books. During a rebellion, the province of Eldred tries to rebel against the heir of the Devery king. To validate their claim, they track down two separate hereditary lines descending from the original Eldred kings, both inherited through the female line. To form the ultimate political claim, they marry these two distant cousins to each other so that their heirs will possess a double bloodline inheritance. Lineage politics is incredibly potent for writers because it is entirely about tying your current authority to the specific deeds and glory of your ancestors. It is a backward-looking form of legitimacy, and it forms one of the primary fronts of that Cold War we'll be discussing. Our third form of legitimacy is magic and divinity, where wielding arcane powers grants you institutional authority. On a basic level, this can function exactly like military might. If a mundane warrior can beat you up, a mage can hit you with a fireball, which naturally commands obedience. But it becomes far more interesting when magic is deeply backed into the legal structure of the court itself. For example, in my own epic fantasy series, the Sangwil Chronicles, the nobility of the Empire of Lumiaron is structurally dependent on magic. To be a lower noble, you must be a Habir, a type of mage whose magic affects and enhances their own physical body. To be a high noble, like a duke or the emperor, you must be a Dusang mage, capable of projecting destructive magical forces to alter the external world. In my world, knowing Dusang, surviving its brutal trials, and wearing the guileless tassel of a Dusang mage is the baseline of political legitimacy. Next, you have economic wealth as a pillar of legitimacy, which gives rise to oligarchic courts where you can effectively buy a seat at the table. Historically, the great merchant empires of Tyre, the Phoenicians, and Carthage operated with a heavy amount of oligarchy built into their ruling structures. The later Venetian Republic is another great example of this. While Venice eventually implemented strict aristocratic registries of the Book of Gold and the Book of Silver to lock down status, in its early days, sufficient merchant wealth allowed families to buy their way onto the Great Council, the very council responsible for electing the Doge. If you have enough coin, you get a seat at the table, and the court becomes an extension of the marketplace. This leads us into our final high-level foundation, elective legitimacy. Now, bear in mind, as world builders, we are not talking about modern democratic elections based on one person, one vote. No. This is a restrictive, aristocratic election. Think of the Holy Roman Empire, where a select council of prince-electors voted to choose who would ascend the throne. The historical papal court operates in the exact same mechanic. The Pope is elected by the College of Cardinals, and once invested with that supreme divine authority, the Pope turns around and grants institutional legitimacy to everyone else in the hierarchy by appointing them to office. Elective systems allow the nobility to maintain absolute control over the voting pool, choosing a leader from their own ranks whom they believe is best suited to protect their collective interests. So those are our macro level foundations of power. But one of the most critical elements that world builders often overlook is that legitimacy is rarely uniform. A real court isn't a monolith. It is an active melting pot where individuals representing these different kinds of legitimacy are forced to survive alongside one another. And that brings us to the incredibly dynamic world-building mechanic that exists in almost every historical and fictional palace, the quiet, backstabbing Cold War between bloodline and merit. So here's the thing, monarchs, East or West, and probably in the Americas as well, though I haven't deeply studied those specific courts, absolutely loved appointing people based on merit. They could not get enough of it.
Editing Marie here. Do I look like I've been editing too long? I've been editing too long. Anyway, I realized as I was doing this section that despite the fact that this is my second take of the video, I forgot to put in that merit isn't actually a legitimacy that goes into a court. Merit is a devolved legitimacy in my kind of model of the court. So what happens is somebody has a legitimacy like military might or magic or blowing things up or bloodline or they're a god or whatever. And then they appoint other people and their legitimacy devolves onto those other people. And those other people might have merit in the view of the kind of master of the legitimacy, the patriarch of the legitimacy, if you will, the guy who actually holds the legitimacy that the rest of the court accepts. And they then share that legitimacy with those they appoint below them. So these guys could all have merit in the eyes of the appointer, although their merit doesn't need to apply to anyone else. Good Lord, my hair looks terrible. I think I'm going to go take a shower when I put on this video to render. Okay, bye.
Take Imperial China, for example. The emperors appointed eunuchs to serve as high-level overseers of the palace. They served as direct counterweight both to the hereditary aristocracy and the official imperial bureaucracy, the scholar gentry who passed the rigorous state exams. Because eunuchs couldn't have children or carry on family lineage, the emperors reasoned that they would dedicate 100% of their loyalty and time to the crown. It's the exact same logic the Byzantine Empire used, where eunuchs also held massive institutional power. In China, the structural division sparked a bloody, albeit hidden and drawn-out war between the outer court, the moralistic scholar bureaucrats, and the inner court, composed of the hyper-loyal and sometimes deeply corrupt eunuchs who controlled physical access to the emperor's person and ear. In the West, you saw a similar dynamic play out when kings bypassed the high nobility to appoint low-ranking knights, merchants, or even foreigners to high-status administrative roles based on merit. We see this historical conflict personified in Game of Thrones with Varys. Varys began life as an enslaved eunuch, crossed the narrow sea, and somehow climbed his way into the Targaryen court to become the Master of Whispers. His ultimate survival mechanism and his functional loyalty was entirely separate from the traditional entitlement of the Westerosi aristocrats. And there is a very practical reason monarchs did this. In the feudal system, if a king pisses off a high-ranking duke, that duke can simply pack up, go home to his ancestral lands, call upon his banners, forge alliances with other disgruntled lords, and launch a massive civil war or coup. There is a reason history is riddled with internal wars, rebellions, and sudden executions, after all. Feudalism is incredibly rigid between classes, but within the ruling class, it's actually quite flat, and there can be a lot of conflict. So a medieval king was less about an absolute dictator and more a primus inter pares, first among equals. He was just the top noble of his specific social class, not an untouchable god king looking down on a unified state. And this is one of the single biggest mistakes people make when world building feudalism. They think that feudal states are strong, highly centralized governments. In reality, the traditional feudal state is a weak central state. The true institutional strength lay entirely within the independent power of the noble houses. The aristocracy possessed their own independent legitimacy, their own private wealth, and their own standing armies. That makes it incredibly dangerous for a monarch to rely solely on aristocrats to run the government. To counter this vulnerability, clever kings hired low-born lawyers, wealthy merchants, and literate foreign clerks to operate their spy networks, manage their treasury, and enforce their legal systems. Because these merit-based officials had zero bloodline legitimacy, their entire status, safety, and wealth depended on the survival of the king. By elevating the lowborn, the monarch effectively centralized their own power, leaving the traditional nobility fuming in the wings. Okay, now that we understand legitimacy and the potential conflict it brings, let's talk about the people who form the court. But before we do that, I have some exciting news. I have just launched the Kickstarter pre-launch page for my upcoming fantasy novel, Blood and Bloom in Las Vegas. Blood and Bloom is an urban fantasy mystery written in a gritty noir style featuring a druid protagonist. It actually won the Flash 500 novel opening competition, and it has all of the deep, intricate world-building elements you'd expect from this channel. That includes a fairy court system that harkens after feudalism, with 4 elemental fairy courts and various nobles attached to each of those. The story also has deep mythological roots, stretching all the way back to ancient Babylonian myths, and it actively draws those myths into the modern world. If that sounds like your kind of read, follow the link in the description below and click on Notify Me so that you get an email the second the Kickstarter goes live this July. Okay, now back to the show. One of the first things you need to understand when constructing a fantasy court is that it isn't a monolith. It is split into 3 distinct, often competing operational groups: the leadership, the working court, and the non-working court. They don't share the same lives, and they certainly don't share the same goals. The leadership consists of the sovereign, the inner council, and the high-level officials. These people are physically present at court because they hold independent power, regional resources, and systemic legitimacy. Think of your small council in Westeros or the council of the monarch in Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar. All of these people hold an intrinsic institutional role that demands their presence at court. And attached to these leaders are their personal staffs, the secretaries and administrators who derive their practical authority from their employers. This is your cabinet and your government. You need a treasurer managing coin, the religious representative integrating the state faith, the chief advisor, like the hand of the king in Game of Thrones. You need a spy master, and you need all of the people who speak for their various clans and regions, as well as clerks and your low-level priests and your secretaries and all of those kind of people. You need to run a kingdom before automation. Here you would use your noble houses to be the secretary of the Privy Seal, or you would use a knight to be a clerk, or etc., etc., etc. The working court is the engine that keeps the palace functional. They are the facilitators who ensure that leadership can actually do their jobs without being buried in the logistics of daily life. Two of the most politically underrated roles here are the heralds and the master of revels. Heralds are your gatekeepers of political branding. As we see in Catherine Kerr's Devery books, a herald is a master genealogist who regulates political symbology. They tell you exactly what you can and cannot put in a sigil because they know whose lineages claim which icons. The master of revels, meanwhile, is effectively the gatekeeper of social geography. They control the schedule and the budget and the seating chart. If hangers-on need to pitch a contract to the High Treasurer, they aren't knocking on the Treasurer's office door. They are bribing the master of revels to ensure they are strategically seated next to the Treasurer at the state ball. And speaking of hangers-on, the non-working court is where the tension truly lies. This group is a mix of socialites, schemers, plotters, political hostages, younger sons with no inheritance, and anyone else desperate to turn social capital into actual wealth. For them, court life is an exhausting non-stop performance of elegance just to maintain their standing. They have the most diverse goals, everything from plotting coups to securing a rich marriage or gaining an influential patron. But because the leadership is busy running an entire country, they implement strict institutional barriers to keep these non-working nobles out. This is where your access rules come into play. And in order to breach those access rules, your non-working court members need to use outsiders to carry messages, or perhaps complete jobs like holding the king's candle while he changes for bed, as Louis XIV made his nobles do. Don't underestimate the political utility of people who exist on the margins of the courts and aren't really part of it, but can move freely inside it. Because they are often viewed as non-political actors, they have unprecedented mobility within the court. Courtesans, like the night-blooming flowers in Cashil's dart, move through the highest circle to deliver sensitive messages. Fools use the protective layer of comedy to mock the powerful and deliver truths that would get a normal courtier executed. And of course, the intimate attendants, like the two-door groom of the stool, gain raw private access to the monarch simply by holding a job that no one else wants. And these people can create access opportunities for your non-working court members. So, whether you are looking at characters like Melisande Scheherazade, who leveraged her own wealth to maintain a presence at court and plot from the sidelines, or younger nobles simply trying to survive, remember this. The non-working court is constantly hunting for a way to turn proximity to power. Your job as a writer is to figure out what barriers the leadership has built to stop them, and exactly how your characters plan to break those barriers down. So when populating the court, consider these 4 categories. Country leadership, including all the positions, the clerks, the nobles, and officers that actually run the country, including your cabinet, the people with constant access to the monarch and real authority, like the treasurer, spy master, and so on. 2. The court facilitators, who run the court like heralds, the master of revels, the groom of the stool, and all of their non-noble, normally, staff that see to lighting fires, cleaning rooms, and so on. then the non-working court where the schemers, the desperates, and the socialites live, and then the outsiders who can move freely through the court but aren't generally seen as political, like the fool or the night-blooming flowers of Tour d'Ange. Populate your court with all of the above, and you will have an amazing source of drama. And now, while the names of the members of this channel scroll past, the incredible patrons who provide the funds to ensure I can bring these videos out for your regular entertainment, let me tell you about the absolute importance of designing a shared language for your court. I've actually done an entire video dedicated to the language of the court, and I'll leave a link in the description. But a LARP that I was involved in perfectly illustrates how important this is, in my opinion. So, I was in a live-action roleplay, a LARP, set in Legend of the Five Rings. At the end of a formal dinner, one of the players stuck her chopsticks upright into a bowl of rice. Now, the courtly etiquette we had constructed for this Japanese-inspired world is that if you stick your chopsticks vertically into the rice, you are accusing your host of trying to poison the meal. So the moment this player did that, it created an uproar. There was challenges to duels, there were accusations flying across the hall, and the political shenanigans were a mess. It completely derailed the Lord's agenda for the evening and threw the court into chaos. But that moment was only so impactful because of the strength of our shared language as players. It only worked because everyone at the table instantly knew what that non-verbal gesture meant. So, when you are constructing your own fantasy court, you must think about how your courtiers communicate non-verbally. I know I rabbit on about non-verbal communication constantly, but it is a critical piece of the puzzle that I cover extensively in Worldbuilding Blueprints, my comprehensive book on the craft of world building. Links to my website down below. But ultimately, a court is an intense, concentrated microculture, and non-verbal communication is how that culture functions. You can go the whole hog and construct an entire systemic language out of physical props. I actually did that recently for one of the courts in Sangwil Chronicles, and I designed a complex language of hand fans, where holding a fan at a specific angle meant one thing, tapping it closed meant another, and fluttering it meant something else entirely. But your shared language doesn't have to be that intricate. It can just be small, sharp, non-verbal symbols that characters use to signal how open or how closed they are to an idea, what they truly think of a rival, or how they perceive somebody else's social standing. And in this category, don't underestimate the power of bowing and physical positioning when constructing your courtly language. How deeply does a character bow to an equal versus a superior? Is there anyone in the realm required to perform a full kowtow, kneeling completely and lowering their face to the floor? On the flip side, is who is legally permitted to remain standing when the sovereign enters the chamber? Is there a single highly privileged individual allowed to remain seated in the presence of the monarch? All of these rules are non-verbal status communicators, and they are vital for maintaining power dynamics of the ruling class. They are the gears that keep the court cohesive. In our next episode, we're going to dive straight into the mechanics of control, both control over the court itself and control of the populace outside the palace walls. We will be exploring how nobles weaponize rituals, access rights, and political hostages to maintain their grip on power. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that drop. If you've made it this far into the architecture of power, leave a chopsticks emoji in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, check out my video on models of inheritance you can use in a fantasy world. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon for another episode. So, this whole series actually kicked off because one of my channel members asked me a deceptively simple question. Why would nobles work together in a court? Why is it that they would cooperate with each other? And how does a court stay unified? Now that we've mapped back the entire ecosystem from the trope-heavy surface to the grim depths of the courtly iceberg, the operational levels of a palace, and the underlying architecture of legitimacy, we can finally tackle that exact question. Let's talk about how and why nobles maintain control over their courts, their properties, and their countries. Welcome to another episode of Just-in-Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. To understand why a room full of heavily armed, hyper-ambitious aristocrats would ever cooperate, we have to look back at the historical sociology behind the origin of dominance hierarchies. Now, it's a common myth that dominance hierarchies spontaneously arose everywhere the moment humans invented agriculture. In reality, many early agrarian societies remained deeply egalitarian, even while practicing sedentary farming. But concentrated dominance hierarchies did eventually emerge independently in a couple of civilizations: the Middle East, Mesoamerica, Egypt, and Peru, and China. And once these centralized hierarchies formed, they spread like wildfire, fundamentally altering the landscape and creating the first states. But what is a dominance hierarchy? Well, at its core, a dominance hierarchy means you have an elite ruling class that organizes the rest of society, and in return for this organization, the elite class extracts wealth from the rest of society. Historically, there are two competing academic schools of thought on how this came to be. First, the conflict or extractive theory. This theory argues that the elite class is essentially a protection racket. They arose simply because they were the best at monopolizing violence and seizing lootable resources. They used that raw material dominance to systemically extract wealth from the working population through cohesion. Lootable resources are plants like grains and so on that can easily be taken by the elites. I did do a video on that, which is linked in the information card. The conflicting theory to this is the integration or managerial theory. This theory argues that as societies grew massive and complex, they required organization to survive. Someone had to coordinate the digging of canal systems, manage irrigation, and track the seasons to declare the exact right time to plant crops. In this view, the elites originally provided a vital public service, and society willingly gave them a share of the harvest in return. Over generations, this administrative class consolidated that privilege into hereditary rule. Personally, I think the historical truth sits somewhere between the two, 6, 7, Although I do lean closer to the extractive wealth theory. Your mileage, of course, may vary. None of us were there. But that's all ancient history, I hear you say. And yes, you're right. But here is why this macro history is vital for your world building. It dictates the baseline of a noble court. No matter how your elites came to power, they are the rulers of their society, and their number one priority is to ensure that they remain the elite. This means, that's just the nature of a dominant hierarchy. This means that whenever a structural threat challenges them from below, the nobility will immediately close ranks. If a rising merchant or a revolutionary peasant leader poses a threat to their institutional authority, the court has two choices. They will either strategically co-opt and adopt the challenger into their own class, or they will completely destroy the challenger. They will cooperate to ensure the survival of their caste barrier. By the time your world building reaches a period resembling the European Middle Ages or feudal Japan, this class distinction doesn't need to be explicitly discussed by the characters. The highborn aren't sitting around in dark rooms being taught on a manual on how to systemically suppress the peasantry. They know it instinctively. It is baked into the fabric of how they are raised from childhood. From the day they are born, people bow to them. People rise the moment they step into a room. The entire world treats them like their status is divinely ordained, and what's more, their shit don't stink. And because of that lifelong conditioning, they genuinely believe that their shit don't stink, and neither do that of their class. So, the court is actively engaged in keeping that class barrier intact, and that is always their first priority. But while it's true that they will present a unified front to an outside challenger, the moment you step inside that closed palace gate, that unity vanishes. Within their own ranks, the nobility is a viper's nest of hyper-competitive actors. So how does a sovereign actually maintain control over a court in an environment that competitive, especially when there isn't an immediate external threat to force them to cooperate? Let's take a look at tools of control next. There are several highly effective ways a monarch can maintain control over his hyper-competitive court. The first strategy is to actively exploit the internal tension we spoke about in the last episode, the ongoing Cold War between bloodline aristocrats and merit-based appointees. Now, notice a critical dynamic here. Those appointed based on merit could easily start chipping away at the rigid caste system if left unchecked. To prevent this, the king strategically pulls these hyper-competent outsiders into the nobility, but not on a permanent basis. If you look at an example of this in A Song of Ice and Fire, Varese is universally addressed as Lord Varese and holds a seat on the king's small council. But his title is non-hereditary. Even if he were capable of having children, that title would still die with him. By utilizing non-hereditary titles, or what we would call life peerages, the king can temporarily elevate an outsider into the ruling class so they have legal standing to compete with traditional lords, but the king avoids diluting the aristocracy with a new hereditary bloodline. Non-hereditary titles are also a brilliant way to dangle status as a carrot while keeping the leash in the crown's hand. The second control mechanism is the manipulation of physical access. There are only 24 hours in a day, or 36 or 12, depending on your fantasy world, and because time is finite, a sovereign can only physically see a limited number of people, as we spoke about last time. Now, if a lord wants to lay a petition before the crown, offer political advice, or smooth over a grievance, they have to physically get in front of the monarch. Historically, even a king's spouse wasn't guaranteed a daily meeting where they could deliver a private message, and children certainly weren't. The scarcity of time gave rise to elaborate, bizarre courtly rituals. As we mentioned, the Tudor kings had the groom of the stool, but Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, took this to a dictatorial extreme. He designed intricate palace rituals that granted nobles direct access to his physical body, but forced them to act like glorified servants to get it. For example, he instituted the coveted ritual of the coucher, where a single hand-selected noble was granted the supreme honor of holding the royal candle while the king undressed. If a duke wanted to whisper a private political request into the king's ear, he had to actively compete against rival lords for the right to hold the king's shirt or hand him his slippers while he was undressing. It was simultaneously humiliating and absolutely necessary. You had the highest dukes of the realm, men who commanded private wealth and massive provincial armies, fighting each other to serve as valets. By forcing them to participate, the king created a system where the nobility was ritually humbled even when they succeeded. Controlling physical access to a monarch completely regulates the environment of the kingdom. But in my opinion, the most single, undervalued strategy for controlling a court is the weaponization of entertainment. I know, Throwing a party doesn't sound like a high-stakes political control strategy, but let me tell you about a book that opened my eyes to this mechanic. I read The Isle of Glass by Judith Tarr, which is part of her Hound and Falcon series. Because Judith Tarr is a medieval scholar, her fiction is intensely well researched. One sequence in the book features King Richard the Lionheart, Coeur de Lion, right after he has successfully put down a domestic rebellion. Richard knew perfectly well that several high-ranking counts and barons had secretly backed the uprising via the backhand, providing funds and quiet support without actively marching their armies into the field. Because they hadn't committed overt treason, he couldn't just execute them and seize their lands without provoking an even larger war. So, how did he handle this? He used weaponized hospitality. In a grand public display, Richard declared that he was going to host a massive 2-month-long tournament in one of the primary suspect cities. He stood before the entire court and told the local count, "We're going to bring our royal retinue to your beautiful city. We'll have hundreds of knights. The whole court will stay here. We'll feast, we'll host grand jousts, and it'll be glorious. And you will play host and foot the bill." Remember, in the medieval period, a city's treasury was the lord's personal treasury. This count was suddenly forced to pay for room, board, wine, and food for thousands of elite, demanding guests for 8 straight weeks. On top of that, he had to provide prize purses for the tournament victors. And all of this staggering expense was done entirely to magnify King Richard's royal glory. The Count couldn't say no. To refuse the leader of his own caste in public would shatter the illusion of noble omnipotence, weakening the vital class barrier between the aristocracy and the peasantry. He had to smile, say yes, and bankrupt his house, even taking out extortionate loans from merchant guilds just to cover the astronomical cost of the royal visit. That is the power of the royal progress and entertainment like it. Traveling from castle to castle with a massive ravenous court allows a monarch to systemically drain the coffers of potentially rebellious vassals. Making your lords play host is a great way to bankrupt them before they can afford to fund a civil war, all without ever having to publicly accuse them. But you don't even need to make them play host. Japan flipped this mechanic on its head. The shogun system required daimyo to spend alternate years in Edo, forcing them to maintain expensive residences and depleting their wealth, because it would not do to appear in court wearing last year's fashion. Money had to be found for a new wardrobe, and that's expensive, yo. So, those are the explicit, overt control mechanisms used to keep a competitive court under the crown's thumb. But there are 2 far more subtle psychological control mechanisms that every world builder should have in their toolkit. 3 more, actually. Just before I tell you about those, let me say that I mentioned a channel member asked me about controlling the court. Well, channel members get a special corner of my Discord all to themselves to ask all kinds of questions. They also get early access to my videos, their name in the credits, and discounts on hiring me as a world building coach. So, if any of that sounds attractive to you, hit the join button right here on YouTube and become a just-in-timer today. Okay, now let's unpack those more subtle psychological levers. While weaponized hospitality and access rules are great overt tactics, a truly calculating monarch relies on 3 far more subtle, multi-generational control mechanisms to keep their vassals cooperative and their class in power. The first is fosterage and hostage politics or cultural assimilation. Now, taking hostages might not sound like a subtle control mechanism on the surface. We've all seen the basic trope. A vassal rebels, the king crushes them, takes their firstborn child as collateral and says, "If you step out of line again, I will hang your son from the battlements." That is the raw, violent essence of the transaction. But the subtlety comes into play when you look at what actually happens to that child once they enter the conqueror's court. When a young hostage is taken into a palace, they aren't generally thrown into a dark dungeon. Instead, they are typically integrated into the household as a page or a squire. We see this dynamic in A Song of Ice and Fire with Theon Greyjoy. After Balon Greyjoy's failed rebellion, a young Theon is taken to Winterfell by Ned Stark. He is raised alongside the Stark children, eats at their table, trains in their yard, and effectively becomes a cultural product of Winterfell. This creates a fascinating, agonizing psychological duality. Over time, the hostage becomes deeply embedded in the culture of the dominant house. And as long as the parent behaves, this relationship guarantees that when the child eventually inherits their family's peerage, they will return home to rule as a pacified leader who thinks, speaks, and acts exactly like the monarch who captured them. Historically, this is basically just a darker, higher stakes variation of the standard noble fostering. Aristocratic houses regularly sent children to be raised by neighbors or the royal house to forge lifelong alliances. Genghis Khan used this hostage technique to control his massive nomadic empire. When he conquered a rival tribe or territory, he would take the children of the defeated leaders as hostages and bring them directly into his own imperial guard, the Keshk. He personally oversaw their training, taught them the military tactics and laws of the Mongols, and ensured that they were loyal to his vision. When they were finally sent back to govern their home territories, they returned not as conquered subjects, but as the Khan's hand-molded administrative assets. So, both fostering and hostage-taking are premier tools for transforming generational enemies into cooperative allies. And that brings us to the gatekeepers of the mind. And this is the second generational tactic. And it's one that I'm almost hesitant about bringing up because I don't want to sound like a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. But the undeniable fact of the matter is this: whatever you teach a child in their formative years and how you teach it to them sticks in their mind. Therefore, whoever controls the infant's nannies, whoever selects the adolescent's tutors, the people teaching the aristocracy letters, mathematics, and histories, ultimately shapes the future of the role. The way these educators frame the world molds a child's mind into either a vital asset to their class or a ticking political time bomb. We see a great example of this educational manipulation in Mercedes Lackey's Voldemort series, specifically in the first Thalia book, Arrows of the Queen. The villainous royal nurse, Hilda, manages to isolate and completely dominate the education of Princess Elspeth, the heir to the throne. Hilda systemically fills the young princess's head with poisonous lies, teaching her to hate and fear the heralds and their magical companions. By deliberately sabotaging the heir's psychological development, Hilda steers the future monarch straight down a path of instability, triggering an institutional crisis within the palace because the heir is being rendered entirely unfit to rule. In a hereditary monarchy, a compromised tutor can bring down a dynasty without ever swinging a sword. Maintaining strict oversight over the palace nursery and academy is a critical part of ensuring the long-term survival of your court. But of course, for all this to work, you need a next generation. And that brings us to the importance of marriage in a royal court. Marriage creates new alliances, not just because it creates new families, but also because women quite often come with dowries of land that could make their husbands rich. In fact, a marriage between a noble with a high title but poor lands or a lot of debt and a low noble or even a rich merchant's daughter who comes with a great dowry was a common way for the high noble to get their finances back on track. And of course, if your sister is in another man's court and you love your sister and that man has military trouble, it's much more likely that a brother will send his army to support his sister's husband. Even more so for a daughter's husband. In addition, the children of the marriage also has extra claims on nobility and titles and all that. So, long story short, do not neglect the power of marriage as a subtle control mechanism. A monarch with a lot of kids has a lot of options for binding other nobles in one of the tightest alliances there is, the alliance of marriage. But of course, despite all the access rules, the weaponized hospitality, the generational programming, human nature being what it is, rebellions will absolutely still happen. And when they do, you are left with the final unyielding iron grip of control: military force. That is the overt ultimate power that underpins the structure. In fantasy world building, this is where you can let your imagination run wild. The king's absolute control might rest on the fact that he commands the largest, most ancient dragon in the sky, meaning any act of defiance ends in ash. Or the sovereign might simply be the single most powerful practitioner of magic in the realm. That was actually the foundational setup for my own epic fantasy series, the Sangwheel Chronicles. The emperor was an exceptionally powerful mage who systemically forged the empire through sheer unmatched arcane dominance. If you choose to disobey him, he could, and absolutely would, ruin your entire existence. However, as a storyteller, you have to remember that resorting to open military conflict is a dangerous gamble. The king could lose. And a military defeat is fatal to a monarch 9 times out of 10. If he loses a battle, he's not losing territory. He loses royal prestige, he weakens the perceived strength of the entire noble caste, and he usually loses his head. Even if the king technically wins the war, if he doesn't win convincingly, he emerges deeply structurally weakened, practically begging for a second, more organized rebellion to rise up and succeed. Because the stakes are so high, a clever monarch will do everything in their power to avoid reaching the point where they actually have to field an army to crush a vassal. But at the same time, they must continuously maintain that standing army, feed those knights, tend that dragon, and cultivate whatever state magic they have at their disposal, just in case. And that is because ultimately the foundational legitimacy of nobility depends on their ability to enforce their will. Never forget the root of how these aristocrats rose and became nobles in the first place. They were the ones who stood up and said, "I will defend you from those marauding warlords over the hill." If they cannot actually deliver on that violent promise, that manipulation of violence, they fail. And we can see this historic truth baked right into our own language. The noble titles of medieval Europe, titles like Duke and Count, evolved from ancient Rome's military ranks. A dux was a military commander of a province. A comes was a highly trusted military companion of the emperor. These elites were martial leaders first, administrators second. And I think this is exactly what people miss when they look at history through a modern lens and say things like, well, modern presidents should lead the charge into battle like ancient kings did. No, they shouldn't. A president's structural legitimacy is not built on their personal ability to wield a sword or command a platoon. In a democracy, a president's legitimacy is built on their ability to convince the population that their policy ideas are the best path forward for the country. But a feudal monarchy, a noble court, its baseline right to rule is built on its monopolization of military power. One way or another, to maintain absolute control over a court of vipers, your fantasy king needs to be able to dominate the battlefield, whether he commands the front line himself or has the institutional power to project trusted, terrifying general in his stead. And now, while the amazing names of the members of this channel scroll past, let me tell you exactly why you should read Judith Tarr. Those books, the Hound and the Falcon series, absolutely blew my mind with the sheer depth of understanding they embedded in me about how the medieval world and its economy and its status functions. There is one scene where she references a character who's become a high-level advisor to the king. He's wearing his heavy, prestigious silver chain of office. He's sitting in a high room at the top of a tower, and there are all kinds of obvious ostentations, signs of wealth surrounding him. But then Tar writes a line to the effect of, "But the true treasure of the room was the single clear pane of glass in the window." That statement alone completely reframed how I viewed medieval economics. Before modern manufacturing, it was incredibly difficult to produce glass with manual labor, and it was exponentially harder to produce clear, see-through glass. And that created, for me at least, the reality of what manual labor means. Clear glass is a supreme, high-status luxury reserved for the ultra-wealthy. Cloth and clothing were expensive because every single thread had to be spun by hand. Beeswax candles were a massive status symbol. Only the highest nobility could afford to keep them because keeping bees was a tedious, manual, dangerous process. Everyone else was stuck burning foul-smelling, smoky tallow candles made from animal fat. It is so incredibly hard for us living in the modern world to shift our minds into a space where we truly grasp the crushing weight of making everything with manual labor. If I can give you just one piece of world building advice, it's this. Remember that no matter what apartment or house you are sitting in right now, no matter how small your room is, you own more physical material possessions than many a noble from the medieval age. Even their grandest castles were not packed with 1,000,000 pieces of furniture. Why? Because every single chair, every table, every storage chest had to be painstakingly handmade by a human using a manual axe, iron nails, and rough stone to sand down the wood. They didn't even have fancy pants sandpaper. They used an actual rock. This manual scarcity is also why monarchs historically held even high-level political conferences inside their bedrooms. Yes, it was about controlling proximity and access, but it was also a matter of raw heating costs. You had to manually chop every single log of firewood, so you only heated a few specific rooms in an entire stone castle. Having a whole separate dedicated room just for people to sit around in and wait to meet with you? Holy crap! The sheer expense that implies. It meant you were insanely, ridiculously rich and could afford to heat dead air. When you are constructing your fictional courts, you must think about the level of automation your society possesses or lacks in the production of material goods, and what that really means for your characters' wealth, status, and daily lives. In our next episode, we are going to dive straight into the biggest mistakes people make when constructing a fantasy court, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that drop. If you've made it this far into the material realities of the past with me, leave a hammer emoji in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this episode, check out my episode of using glass in a fantasy world next. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon for another episode.
So there you are, lying in a pool of your own sticky blood on the floor of your palace. And I bet the last thought going through your mind is, where are my bodyguards? Hello, and welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host Marie Mullaney. Today I would like to talk to you about bodyguards in a fantasy world. Bodyguards for your emperor, bodyguards for your king, bodyguards for your local lord, bodyguards for your church. I would like to discuss how these bodyguards have evolved in our world, what the historical precedent is for bodyguards, and which models are available to you as a fantasy author, how you can train up these bodyguards and create them, what impact certain uniforms have on them, and how you can use this element of world building in your plot. If you have not yet subscribed, please do hit the subscribe button and let's get cracking. First, let's look at the historical precedent. One of the most famous examples of bodyguards in our history is undoubtedly the Praetorian Guard from the Roman Empire. Now, the Praetorian Guard actually started as a group of battlefield guards as the closest companion of a Roman general for the Republic that was available in the field. Because Roman generals were obviously active in the field of battle, these troops provided them with a measure of protection so that the general's not going to be the subject of the unfortunate slings and arrows of the enemy combatant. From there, the practice eventually became that of being the bodyguards of the emperor, with all of the status implied in this. And eventually, the Praetorian Guard became much more than this. They became, in and of themselves, kingmakers. They were actively involved in assassinating emperors, including Caligula. In fact, the Praetorian Guard had held such power that at their height, they auctioned off the imperial throne of Rome from the walls of their fortress. So they have had a rich and lurid history. And if you're interested in more, I recommend the channel Invicta's coverage of the Praetorian Guard. So they're a good example of what your bodyguard can offer you in terms of plot points and how you can construct them in terms of their uniforms. They had these special helmets that they wore. They had these special Roman battle standards that they carried into battle. They were very different. They stood out from the normal troop. And of course, they have a multitude of plots, from foiling assassination to guarding the monarch on the battlefield to assassinating the monarch. But we deal in fantasy worlds here. So what effect does magic have on your bodyguards? The answer to that question largely depends on what kind of magic system you have. If you have a soft magic system, it is unlikely that there is much impact on your bodyguard type people. The reason for that is it's too unpredictable. A bodyguard trains for predictable scenarios of saving their liege's life and for unpredictable scenarios as best they can. But a soft magic system means that they don't have reliable means of predicting when it will happen. And that, to me, says that it can't be included in the training regimen of bodyguards in a world with a soft magic system. And if you think of the worlds with soft magic systems, the two that come to mind most easily for me is George R.R. Martin's world and the world of Jacqueline Carey in the Cashel books. In both of these books, your bodyguards are purely swordsmen. In George R.R. Martin, it's blood of my blood, the Dothraki riders on the one side, or the King's Guard, or the Queen's Guard, or the Rainbow Guard. All of those are warriors. And in Cashel's Chosen, the most famous bodyguards are without doubt the Casselines, who are priest soldiers. In both cases, magic doesn't feature. Now, if you have a hard magic system, on the other hand, and your magic is reasonably common, it stands to reason that if your magic has got military application, it would affect your guard. And this is the case in my world in the Imperial Guard. Now, the Imperial Guard in my world is called the Dragon Guard. They wear these little helmets that have got dragon wings on them, and they are all mages. They use the magic called hobby, which allows you to make yourself stronger, faster, jump further. It gives you some healing abilities, and there are certain advanced applications. So all of my Imperial Guard are hobbyers, because hobby is a fairly common magic and it's a hard magic system. Another good example of this is the Steel Inquisitors from the Mistborn world, where they are the guards of the Lord Ruler. Now, I will talk more about the Lord Ruler when I get to plot points and what you can do with your bodyguards in those situations. Now, what if you have a hard magic system, but your magic is fairly uncommon? In that case, your guard will probably train to counter magic, but they probably won't be mages themselves.
because at that point you need to protect your mages. You can't afford for mages to be at risk taking bullets for other people. So if your magic is uncommon, it is much more likely that your mage will have bodyguards. But your guard will be trained to counter magic, because magic is a predictable force, because it is a hard magic system. And that is the effect of magic on your bodyguards, in my opinion. But there is more than just magic to consider with your bodyguards. One of the things that I mentioned about the Praetorian Guard is that they had those helmets with the brush top. The clothing of your bodyguard matters. Remember, this is an elite unit. When somebody sees them, it should strike fear into their hearts. It should warn off an assassin just by their presence. And indeed, it is a great place to do a lot of fantastic world building. When you think about the King's Guard of George R.R. Martin, you think about the White Cloaks. When you think about Renly's Guard, you think about the Rainbow Cloaks. When you think about Khal Drogo's Blood of My Blood, his closest riders, you don't think so much about them because they didn't wear anything distinctive. They were just known as Blood of My Blood. So the name sticks with you, but the image that comes up in your head is just one of normal Dothraki. And that to me illustrates the importance of putting something visual on your elite guard unit, something that your readers or your players will remember. And when they see that thing, they recognize it and they act accordingly. So besides my dragon guard with their little stubby wings, I have another elite bodyguard unit that operate in the southern continent, the continent of Kisangi. And they are called the daggers because they are forged like daggers. They're forged to be weapons. They follow a different model from my dragon guard who follow the elite soldier model. The daggers follow the child soldier model. And they are all considered to be slaves of the house. So they wear a slave collar, but it's a special slave collar, one with little daggers engraved on it. And that is their symbol of what they are and who they are. And speaking of the daggers, their home is a set of islands that is quite some distance away from the main continent of Kisangi. And that brings up an interesting point. Where do your bodyguards live? Do they all live in a barracks? Are they not allowed to marry? How do you get more of them? What happens if they do marry? What sort of honors do you give them? Do they have special medals that they can wear? Like if they've actually saved somebody's life, do they get a little medal that they can pin to their breastplate? Do they get special honors that they can drape around their neck? Additional, badges for their battle standard. You need to think about things that make them distinctively stand out. These are some of your most elite units. They should be memorable in people's minds, both from a reader's perspective, a player's perspective, and in world. People should regard them with a certain amount of awe and should be looking for their honors and their uniform to stand out. The other thing that you should consider is how many of these guards are there and what that says about your world. The Sardaukar were basically a whole army that are the bodyguards of the emperor. The Praetorian guards were many. Conversely, George R.R. Martin's white cloaks are 9, if I remember correctly. The Catiline guards from the Kashil books are only assigned 1 to each household. What does that imply about the differences between the cultures? If you need an army or a large unit to protect your key principle that you are defending, it speaks to a culture that is very warlike. It speaks to a culture where the emperor could, in theory, be required to take to the battlefield and needs battlefield bodyguards. So it's not just a case of you're protecting one person against assassination and giving them time for the rest of the forces to get there or the rest of the guard to get there or anything like that. the unit is expected to defend the principal even in battlefield situations. If you assign one guard to a person, that implies that it's much more likely that they're defending against assassination than that they're defending against battlefield style of attacks. If you are drawing up a militaristic society, it is much more likely that you're going to have a large guard. If this is more of a soft power society, you're much more likely to have just one guard per person or maybe two guards per person. We come to the big one, training models. How do you train and select your guard? So in my viewpoint, there's essentially two ways you can go about a training model. The one is the best in the land. So the best in the land is like what is used in George R.R. Martin's world, where there is a tournament, and from this tournament, the best knight is selected and invited to become part of the king's guard. You don't have to go with, once you've won, that's it, you're in the guard unit. What I do with my dragon guard, as an example, is I have a tournament. If you do well in that tournament, you are invited to join the dragon guard. But after joining the Dragon Guard, you go through a year of very intensive training. Now, I did model this loosely on the SEAL training. So you've got a period of time where you're on probation and they're trying to make you quit, and then a period of time where you're training properly, and then daily training after that. On a continuous basis. But you can also go with an approach of you win the tournament, you're part of the White Guard, and yes, they train together, but they don't train especially. It's more about your innate talent than your elite training. The other model that you can follow is the child soldier model. Now, this is what is done with the Sardaukar in Dune. It is what I do with my daggers. So normally it's something like these guys are taken as children. They are put into this regimen of training that results in about 50% of them dying, 50% or more of them dying. And at the end, it spits out these seriously elite troops that are brutal, that have loyalty only to the thing that they've sworn to, and are basically without personality, because the personality has been beaten out of them. There's another model that is used by Jacqueline Carey in the Kashil books for the Casseline Brotherhood. Now here, young boys join the Casseline Brotherhood at the age of 10, and they do go through an intensive training regimen. But it is not one that results in fatalities. It is not one that is geared towards breaking them down as people and reconstructing them to the point where they will do heinous things without even blinking twice. They still maintain their morality. They are still part of their society. Now, the child soldier does offer you some interesting plot points. In the movie Soldier with Kurt Russell, they demonstrate one of those plot points to great effect, which is overcoming that innate training. Can you overcome that training to grow a conscience? And this was beautifully done in that movie. So you could write a story from the perspective of one of these child soldiers who is overcoming their training, who becomes more than just a weapon. In the Kashil books, Jocelyn Verul overcomes his early training as part of his character progression through the books, and he goes from being Fedre's bodyguard to being her lover, and their relationship lies at the core of the first trilogy, and it is just beautifully done. I highly recommend it to everyone, as you no doubt know if you've been following this channel. I want to discuss two special plots that bodyguards give you. I said I wanted to come back to Steel Inquisitors. It is that time. The first one that I want to discuss is the use to which Brandon Sanderson put the Steel Inquisitors in the Mistborn world. When you meet the Steel Inquisitors, you think that they are the Lord Ruler's most badass minions. You think that they are his bodyguards, his kick-ass troops, the guys he's going to employ to
be the character's main overcome in the story. He always has two with him, and they seem to be very powerful opponents. They're a total fake out. When the characters take care of most of the Steel Inquisitors in the capital city, and it's like, okay, they're going to do this, it's going to work, the Lord Ruler himself curb stomps them with minimal effort. He never needed those Steel Inquisitors. They were a fake out. They were a stalking horse to draw people out, to misdirect attention, to do his dirty work for him. He didn't need them. And that kind of shadow play is a fantastic use of bodyguards, where you don't actually use the bodyguard to guard you because you don't need it. Instead, you use the bodyguards to draw people into attacking those bodyguards, to draw the attention of your enemies, and that fake out allows you to appear much weaker and almost be a lure for your enemies to attack. So that's a great plot use of bodyguards. The other use of bodyguards comes to us from Kashil, and I'm going to give a spoiler warning here for Kashil's Chosen. In Kashil's Chosen, the Queen Ysandra is guarded by 4 Casseline brothers. One of them was the brother of the woman that was engaged to Ysandra's father before her death resulted in Ysandra's mother getting engaged to Ysandra's father. This Casseline brother was called Bryce Norin Forte because he had given up his family name, but his real family name was preserved in the archives of the Casseline Brotherhood. Now, there was a rumor that Ysandra's mother had caused the death of this guy's sister, right, so that she could get engaged to the crown prince. That rumor was never proved, but it did exist nonetheless. And our main villain, Melisande, about who I made a whole video, you can check her out over there, used that information to turn Bryce Norin Forte against Ysandra and convince him to try and assassinate her. And he actually tried to do that. He was going to perform the Terminus, which is a special Casseline move where they slit their own throats while throwing one of their daggers at their ward. Basically, it's like a last-ditch, better that you die than that you fall into the hands of your enemy move. So he was preparing to perform the Terminus when Jocelyn Verul, our Casseline who has given up being a Casseline, who has overcome his training, when Jocelyn interrupted his Terminus move and saved Ysandra's life. If you have bodyguards who are very close to your monarch, running an assassination plot through those bodyguards is a fantastic story because they are right on top of the monarch. They can kill the monarch with ease. And indeed, the Praetorian Guard proved this when they killed Caligula. And he is not the only man to have died at the hands of his own bodyguard. So you can always use the bodyguard as a means of assassination by themselves. And that is my take on bodyguards in a fantasy world. If you'd like me to explore any other specific topics around them, please do comment down below. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.
We've been on a journey together throughout this series on royal courts, exploring how you construct them from the ground up, the distinct types of people you populate them with, the bizarre rituals that bind them together, and the cutthroat mechanisms used to control them. Now, we have finally arrived at our 5th and concluding episode. Today, we are going to dive into the biggest mistakes world builders make when designing a noble court, alongside the little odds and sods, those extra vivid textures of daily life that will make your fictional palace feel like a completely unique, living, breathing space. Welcome to the final episode of our Royal Court series, and another episode of Just in Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. Our very first topic of conversation today is the way that writers design the internal political factions that populate a palace. Far too often, I see world builders fall directly into the two-faction trap. They create a political landscape that basically amounts to good guys party versus bad guys party. It looks like a modern first-past-the-post political environment, where you have a blue team and a red team and everyone just files neatly into two giant ideological tents. But a medieval or fantasy court does not work like a modern two-party democracy. Bear in mind that most nobles sit on top of their own independent provincial power base. Because of that, alliances between factions are fluid, ever-shifting, and constantly evolving based on immediate circumstances. They might cooperate because their personal relationships align, because they share a temporary or strategic goal, or simply because one lord happens to be married to another lord's sister. But the moment those underlying conditions change, the alliances change as well. It's also a massive mistake to assume that a court is divided into people who are completely on the king's side versus people who want to overthrow him. As a baseline rule of thumb, a reigning monarch generally commands sort of 50% support from the nobility. Otherwise, you aren't looking at court intrigue anymore. You're probably starting to look in the direction of active civil war. But having a lord support the monarch doesn't mean they agree with them automatically, and it doesn't mean the people opposing the crown are bad guys. Highborn lords will actively oppose a sovereign over a single specific policy decision, while remaining completely loyal to the institution of the crown itself. Look at history's greatest knight, William Marshal, the first Earl of Pembroke. Marshal detested King John, known as John Lackland. He thought John was a petulant, incompetent ruler, and John made countless atrocious decisions that actively harmed Marshal's interests. Yet, when the rest of the barons revolted, Marshal stuck by the king. Why? Because Marshal possessed an unyielding, rigid code of chivalric honor and believed in the supreme preservation of his class hierarchy. He supported the man holding the crown, despite hating the man himself. This psychological nuance is one of the reasons why Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire is so compelling, in my opinion. The courtly factions in Westeros are a constantly moving mosaic. House Tyrell of Highgarden doesn't just pick a team and stay there. They align with Renly Baratheon first, then switch to the Lannisters when Renly dies, and eventually shift their allegiance to the Targaryens. The Starks and the Lannisters might remain fixed ideological poles, but the rest of the realm shifts and sways as their long-term strategic interest dictates. We see another masterclass in faction design in Jacqueline Carey's Cashil's Dart. Early in the books, there's a high-stakes plot led by Lionette de Travaillon to overthrow her brother, the king, and put her son Bowden de Travaillon on the throne instead. Throughout the narrative, different lords at court align with Lionette's faction and then quietly pull away as the wind changes. For instance, Marquis Solan Balfour, the keeper of the Privy Seal, is initially aligned with a conspiracy. But as the plot thickens, she gets cold feet. She starts asking herself, is this plot actually going to succeed? Or am I going to end up holding the bag for failed treason? To protect herself, Solane sets up a steep price for her continued cooperation. She demands a written message from Lionette delivered physically by Bowden. Why? Because having that physical letter gives Solane blackmail leverage. If the coup fails, she has leverage to ensure Lionette works hard to protect Solane from backlash. The factions surrounding the Balfour house thus shifted their position away from the treasonous plot. And notice how Carey writes the conspirators. Bowden and Lionette are not portrayed as moustache-twirling villains or cruel tyrants out to ruin the countryside. They're just profoundly ambitious, hyper-capable aristocrats who genuinely believe they could do a better job ruling the kingdom than the current king. When you are building your own fictional courts, treat your factions with this level of respect. Abandon binary morality. Do not make it a war between pure good and pure evil within a court. Give every house a strategic goal. Think about exactly what these noble families want to achieve over the next 50 years for their lineage. And allow alliances to be fluid. Let economic shifts and failed plots naturally force old enemies into uncomfortable beds or shift alliances away. Long story short, give your factions separate motivations, strategic goals, and let them realign as the world changes around them. Speaking of motivation, I cannot tell you how often I see the politics in fantasy books fall completely flat, even when the book isn't strictly a political fantasy, but just a standard epic journey, because the political symbols are empty. They're hollow, they're flat. And why? Because instead of giving an internal court factions a real breathing motivation, the world builder has focused entirely on symbology. It's the kind of writing where you can tell the good guys from the bad guys simply because the loyalists wear a flat felt cap while the conspirators wear top hats. Now, don't get me wrong, I love me some symbology. I absolutely adore giving factions distinct visual symbols that they can wear, display, and flex with. That is an essential part of world design. In my own Sangville Chronicles, I used the mandatory noble sash to visually differentiate the aristocracy, turning a piece of silk into a vital part of the empire's socio-political language. In my world's religion, I work in symbology constantly, differentiating factions by whether they wear Soa charms or brotherhood necklaces or coarse seal belts. You 100% need symbology for your factions. But here is your golden rule. Symbology is an outgrowth of the faction's history and its goals. It does not take the place of motivation. Giving a political faction a funny hat just so the reader can distinguish them is the courtly equivalent of the classic sci-fi trope Planet of the Hats. Except instead of applying it to an alien race, you're applying it to a palace room. A symbol must be a shorthand for a deeply held belief, an economic reality, or a historical grievance. Without that underlying substance, it's an empty shell. Factions in a real court absolutely utilized iconography. We see it over and over again in our own history. In the English Civil War, the parliamentarian Roundheads purposefully cut their hair close to visually distance themselves from the long flowing ringlets of the royalist cavaliers. During the fall of the Merovingians, the ancient Merovingian kings, who considered their long uncut hair to be literal sacred source of their royal right to rule, were shaved. When Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, was deposed by Pepin the Short, son of Charles the Hammer Martel, the Carolingians didn't just strip his title. Before locking him away in a monastery, they publicly shaved his head. They used a pair of shears to physically and symbolically execute his divine legitimacy. Heck, think of the Crusaders. The medieval knights who wore the Crusader cross stitched directly onto their surcoats as a literal badge of holy warfare. So, symbology, important. We see it wonderfully handled in modern fiction too. In Game of Thrones, we have the house devices and ancestral words. Hear me roar, winter is coming, we do not sow. But these are not cool marketing slogans. They are distilled summaries of each house's generational trauma, geography, and political ideology. In Cashil's Dart, the intricate heraldry isn't just limited to the highborn houses. It extends down to the houses of the night court, the specific flowers and motifs worn by the specialized courtesans represent a shared cultural philosophy regarding service, art, and divine desire. So symbols are important, do not get me wrong, but only when they represent something real. A symbol must be an organic outgrowth of a faction's ideology, strategy, and the real human characters who wear that symbol. Otherwise, you aren't actually writing a court. You're just hosting a costume party. Speaking of parties, there is another court building mistake that drives me batty. The assumption of perfect information. Far too often in fantasy books, news travels through the palace like a modern fiber optic network. A secret conversation happens in the dark corner of the gardens during the latest royal party, and by breakfast the next morning, the entire nobility somehow know the exact, unfiltered truth of what was said. Do these writers honestly think that rumors, the game of broken telephone, and malicious gossip were invented in the 20th century? In a real historical court, information was a muddy, distorted mess. People made up stories constantly. They slandered their rivals. They spread absurdly salacious rumors and actively engaged in malicious character assassination. And the more ridiculous and scandalous the rumor was, the faster it spread. Think about the contrast between our world and theirs. If I hear a shocking piece of news on the internet today, my baseline instinct is to fact check it. I look for at least 2 independent sources, preferably with different political leanings, to verify the core facts, and even then, I analyze the framing of those facts. We have an unprecedented global ability to verify data in real time. But in a medieval or fantasy court setting, you could tell a bald-faced lie, and the only way for someone to check its validity is to physically ask the person the lie was about. And what if that person isn't even at court? What if they're miles away on a military campaign? King Richard the Lionheart spent years locked away as a captive hostage in Germany, while his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, struggled to hold his kingdom together. You can bet your bottom dollar that the court back home was drowning in wild rumors spread by his brother John Lackland to undermine Richard's legitimacy. And this slander doesn't just stop when a person dies. It cements itself into history. Look at the historical reputation of King Richard III. Thanks to William Shakespeare, generations of theatregoers grew up believing Richard III was a literal monster, a moustache-twirling villain with a hunchback and evil dripping from his fangs, who murdered the princes in the Tower out of pure, unadulterated malice. But modern historians will tell you that Richard III probably wasn't any more wicked than any other highborn noble of his era. Let's be real. Practically all medieval aristocrats were hyper-ambitious power players who did pretty terrible things to ensure their family's survival. That was the job. But because his enemies won the war, the rumor and the slander became the permanent narrative. You can check out my video on propaganda in the info card. This distinction is vital for you to understand in world building. Feudal courts are not ideological. They are personal. These nobles aren't fighting over abstract policy papers or economic theories. They are fighting for themselves, their bloodlines, and their family properties. In an environment that deeply personal, gossip and rumors aren't just idle chatter to pass the time. They are weapons of war. If you can successfully ruin a rival lord's reputation, cast doubt on the legitimacy of his heir, or make the king suspect him of treason while he's away from the palace, you can destroy his house without having to draw a sword. So, strip your characters of their perfect information. Let them operate in the dark, let them make catastrophic decisions based on bad data, and let the vipers in your court weaponize the whisper network to its limits. Just before I tell you why policy does still matter, give me a moment to tell you about my latest fiction book, Blood and Bloom in Las Vegas. This is an urban fantasy book with a fast-paced mystery involving the fairy courts, a dastardly sorcerer, and a plot to change the way the world works. It won the Flash 500 award in 2025, and this is what the judges said about it right here. If that sounds interesting to you, check out the Kickstarter on the links below. Okay, back to the show. Now, Just because I said that court politics are deeply personal rather than ideological, that does not mean that policy doesn't matter. I see this mistake all the time in fantasy as well. A world builder will create a faction of good guys who are noble, honorable, wonderfully sweet human beings, but they have absolutely shitty economic policy. They tax the snot out of the populace to fund some grand, noble, idealistic goal that doesn't actually do a damn thing to foster the physical well-being of the realm. Let me tell you what happens to those honorable good guys. They end up with a massive bloody peasant rebellion in short goddamn order. Your fantasy king can be the sweetest, kindest, most well-meaning boy to ever sit his ass on the throne. But if his actual application of policy fails to encourage trade, secure peace, protect the economy of his kingdom, he will face an uprising. Ideology might not be what the aristocratic vipers are actively fighting over in the palace corridors, but the real-world consequences of their policy remain relevant. And conversely, look at your bad guys. If your antagonists are hyper-competent administrators who pass excellent agricultural policies, keep trade routes completely safe from bandits, and ensure their peasants stay fat, healthy, and economically stable, the fact that they are ruthless, terrible human beings in their private lives is not going to matter to those peasants, not even a little. Remember, history from a peasant's perspective is this. As far as the working class is concerned, the entire nobility sucks. They all systemically extract wealth from labor. They are all part of an oppressive dominance hierarchy. So to a peasant, the abstract morality or honor of a lord is kind of, sure, okay, honor and all that. The question that matters is, how bad is my daily life under the specific person's rule? How much tax do I need to pay? And am I free to marry my daughters to people? If they are constantly overtaxed, if they are constantly oppressed, it doesn't matter how poetically beautiful the Lord is. If a ruthless usurper takes over and lowers taxes and gives free access to the mill to the peasants, those peasants are going to stand behind that bad guy in a solid, unyielding front. This dynamic is especially critical to remember because the feudal system is, say it with me now, a deeply decentralized environment. And because of that, every individual lord gets to set the immediate micro policies within their private lands. The king might set the wider macro policies for the kingdom, but he has very few resources to actually implement them on his own. He is dependent on his independent vassals to enforce royal law within their own boundaries. So when you are designing your fictional courts, look past the personal morality of your characters and analyze the material reality of their governance. If your good guys have terrible policy, give them an angry mob. If your bad guys look after their people, give them a fiercely loyal provincial power base. Just because the politics of the court are personal doesn't mean the policies don't have consequences. Now, while we've established that the nobility will fiercely protect their caste barrier, you cannot treat your lower classes as a passive, invisible monolith. The lower classes do have a shaping impact on the royal court. When things get bad enough, peasants will act. You had massive coordinated uprisings like Wat Tyler's rebellion in 14th century England, where an army of labourers marched right into London, shook up the royal establishment, and forced the young King Richard II to personally negotiate with them on the field. But outside of open, violent revolutions, there is also a more subtle, insidious pressure creeping up from below all throughout the medieval period, and that is the rising merchant class. As trade routes expand and urban centers grow, wealthy merchants and guild masters start accumulating obscene amounts of liquid wealth. And once a merchant gets rich enough, they inevitably want to do one thing. They want to break into the nobility. Now, getting a king to hand you a brand new hereditary title out of thin air is really hard and politically fraught. But bypassing the king and marrying into a title, that's a whole different story. Aristocratic noble houses did sometimes, and sometimes frequently, fall into disastrous financial ruin. They were title rich but cash poor, buried under a mountain of debt from funding private wars, paying off royal progress fees, or trying to maintain an extravagant lifestyle at court. When a noble house hit rock bottom, marrying the heir off to a wealthy merchant's daughter was a great way to eject some very needed fresh cash into the family coffers through the daughter's dowry. But this economic survival tactic does come at a social cost. It tanked the prestigious status of that house. The moment the proud ancient lineage brought new money into the family, the rest of the hyper-competitive court would close in like little sharks. There would be gossip behind fans, snickers in the hallways, and they would treat the family like a bunch of desperate money-grubbing tradesmen. So in your world, where your right to rule is built on the illusion of a divine, unblemished blood, marrying a merchant was very much a compromise. Playing with this dynamic is a great source of drama for world builders. It introduces a source of internal friction, political intrigue, and narrative flavor that will make your court feel incredibly rich. So while you absolutely must keep your nobility fiercely protective over their status, never forget that the walls of the palace are under constant pressure. Peasants will revolt when pushed to the brink. Merchants will use their gold to chip away at the elite class barrier from the inside out. Now, I know, I spent the first segment warning you to be wary of hollow iconography, but the exact opposite mistake is just as dangerous. If you construct your palace using nothing but standard generic fantasy tropes, like a basic herald shouting names at a door, a throne room with a red carpet, and a standard feast, your setting completely blends together with a forgettable piece of historical stock art. To make your court unforgettable, you need to design unique, localized rituals. These rituals shouldn't just be random background dressing. They should actively serve as a language for the court's internal politics. Let's look back at Jacqueline Carey's Cashil's Dart series. In the kingdom of Ter d'Ange, they celebrate a massive masked ball on the longest night of the year, the winter solstice in December. During this festival, the entire court wears masks and they perform a sacred traditional ritual play celebrating the rebirth of the Sun Prince. When Bowden de Trevelyan was launching his quest to usurp the throne, he volunteered to play the role of Sun Prince in the solstice performance. Well, actually I think Melisande volunteered him rather than him volunteering himself, but same diff. He played the role of the Sun Prince is the point. By donning that specific costume, he sent a public signal to the rest of the vipers at court. I am ready to become king, even if I'm not the direct heir. Books later, a young queen's heir does the exact same thing. Sidonie steps onto the floor in a costume directly reminiscent of that same Sun Prince play, using the court's shared theatrical language to signal that despite being a woman, she is ready to defend her birthright and absolutely no one is going to usurp her. That is the power of a culturally embedded ritual. It gives your characters a completely unique stage to play their political games on. And don't overlook those intimate high access rituals we discussed earlier, like Louis XIV's lever and cowsher, where the dukes fought each other just for the right to hold onto a candle or a shirt. I recently built a court for my own epic fantasy work, the court of Port Lango in the continent of Kisangani. In this setting, the reigning monarch, known as the Malina, never speaks directly to the assembled court. Instead, the Malina communicates entirely through a designated official known as the Voice. To make this ritual visually and culturally striking, the Voice wears an intricate veil made of heavy ivory beads, completely covering their mouth. When the voice is silent, the veil remains closed, masking their mouth. But the second they speak on the Molino's official's word, they draw those ivory beads back. This is a functional status flare and an organic outgrowth of how the Kisangani culture operates. It is designed to structurally protect the sovereign from the vulnerability of direct speech, elevating the crown's mystique. At the same time, it tells the audience a story about the material reality of the region. Port Longo is a wealthy trade port that actively exports exotic ivory from its native wildlife. Doing something like that, like swapping out a generic medieval Herod for a bead-veiled voice, tears your world away from historical stock art. It gives your world a unique cultural flavor. So when you're designing your palaces, give them distinct ceremonies. Think about what they eat, what they wear, how they hide their faces, and how they display their power. Unique rituals are the exact tool that will distinguish your fictional court from a generic history textbook. And now, while the amazing names of the members of this channel scroll past, let me tell you about one final bonus mistake. Now, I haven't spoken about royal guards much during this specific episode or this series, and the reason for that is simple. I have already done a whole dedicated deep dive video into the mechanics of royal guards, which you can check out in the information card. But one of the single biggest mistakes I see people make when they do write royal guards is making those guards loyal to the point of ridiculousness. Writers forget that the members of a royal guard are also human beings, and quite often they are drawn directly from the ranks of the nobility itself, meaning they are just as prone to ambition and personal grudges as any other court viper. If a king treats his royal guard poorly, chances are exceptionally high that he is going to end up with a sword in his back at some point. Look at what happened to King Ares II in A Song of Ice and Fire. The moment the Mad King decided he wanted to burn King's Landing to the ground, Jaime Lannister looked at his sworn oath, looked at the reality of the situation, and said, yeah, no, I'm not going to let you burn the city. And he put a sword straight through his sovereign. Or look at the real-world history of the Praetorian Guard under the emperors of Rome. Sure, the Praetorians looked after the emperor 100%. Right up until the exact moment they didn't. There was a famously chaotic period in Roman history where the Praetorian Guard literally put the entire throne of the Roman Empire up for an auction to the highest bidder. And just as bad is a monarch who treats the royal guard like shit and yet suffers no consequences. In a society whose baseline legitimacy is built on the monopoly of violence, how on earth do you justify treating the elite soldiers who stand directly behind your back like absolute garbage? Treating your protectors badly is just a loud, clear invitation for disaster. Even if they don't explicitly assassinate you themselves, they might just conveniently choose to step aside, look the other way, and let a different assassin slip right through into your chambers. When you are designing your royal guards, think deeply about what motivates them, how well or how poorly the monarch treats them, and exactly what impact that dynamic has on your courtly politics. And that officially concludes our series on royal courts. There is going to be a definitive guide compilation coming down the pipeline pretty soon, which will stitch all of these parts together alongside a few other relevant episodes, like that Royal Guard video I mentioned, into an hours-long video. Keep an eye out for that if you want to experience the whole courtly architecture as one long, epic masterclass. If you have made it this far into the palace depths with me, leave me a crown emoji in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this episode, check out my video on the biggest mistakes people make with rebellions next. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon for another episode.